Future faking. Every morning, countless people wake up fully convinced that the dreams they've built alongside someone special are on the brink of becoming real. The house they've discussed, the vacations they've intricately planned, even the children whose names they've lovingly chosen, all feel tantalizingly close. These aren't ordinary daydreams, but carefully constructed illusions, planted by someone who specializes in the sinister psychological trick known as future faking. Future faking is a manipulative tactic favored by narcissists wherein they paint elaborate, idealized visions of the future to emotionally captivate and control their targets. It's not as simple as telling a lie, it's far subtler and far more devastating. These manipulators skillfully craft scenarios that promise deep intimacy, lasting happiness, and emotional fulfillment. By doing this, they distract their victims from the unsettling truths of the present, ensuring they remain loyal, patient, and emotionally invested, despite the manipulator having no genuine intention of ever bringing these fantasies to life. This technique is powerful because it targets one of our most vulnerable human emotions, hope. By creating promises they never plan to fulfill, manipulators hold their victims captive, endlessly bound by the fantasy of a perfect tomorrow. As long as the victim believes in that imagined future, they're less likely to leave, question motives, or demand accountability. In this cruel psychological trap, victims willingly offer their love, trust, and resources, waiting indefinitely for a reality that never comes. Take, for instance, Ella's experience with Mark. They met at a friend's wedding, and Mark immediately charmed Ella with his sincerity and passion. Within weeks, he started planning a shared future, talking about marriage, describing the home they'd buy, even picking out pets together. Ella became emotionally invested, believing she'd found someone whose dreams matched her own. But over time, months turned into years, and each time Ella approached Mark about their plans, he skillfully provided plausible reasons for the delays: work challenges, financial setbacks, family emergencies. These explanations seemed genuine, keeping Ella hopeful yet increasingly anxious. It took years for her to finally realize that Mark had no intention of following through. The promised future had simply been a tool for emotional manipulation. The twisted ingenuity of future faking lies in how subtly manipulators maintain their control. They rarely make explicit lies that can be easily confronted. Instead, they carefully prolong the state of anticipation, dangling fulfillment just out of reach, yet always close enough to seem attainable. They exploit the natural human tendency to hope, twisting optimism into something painful, confusing, and addictive. Breaking free from future faking involves recognizing patterns of delay, false promises, and emotional manipulation. It requires a conscious decision to confront reality, no matter how painful, and to acknowledge that the future envisioned together was never genuinely shared. Awareness becomes the most powerful weapon against this form of manipulation, as clarity dismantles the illusions carefully built by the manipulator. Understanding future faking empowers victims to differentiate between empty promises and authentic commitments. This knowledge helps individuals reclaim their autonomy and ensure that their emotional investments are based on concrete actions rather than mere words. Once someone grasps the disturbing dynamics of future faking, they're finally able to regain control over their lives and futures, ensuring that their dreams belong to them alone, not to those who seek to exploit their hope. Ambient abuse. There's a form of emotional manipulation so subtle, so quiet, that most people don't even realize it's happening until the damage is already done. It's not loud arguments or obvious insults. Rather, it thrives in whispers, in sighs, and in the silent withdrawal of affection. It's known as ambient abuse, an invisible psychological toxin that slowly poisons a person's sense of reality and self-worth, leaving them feeling increasingly lost, confused, and profoundly alone. Ambient abuse is different from other forms of emotional manipulation precisely because of its subtlety. Instead of openly aggressive actions, the abuser uses understated gestures, subtle shifts in behavior, and minimal, almost imperceptible remarks designed to slowly erode their victim's confidence. Over time, the targeted individual begins to question their perception, their worth, and even their sanity without fully understanding why. This is exactly what makes ambient abuse one of the most sinister psychological tactics used by narcissists. It operates in the shadows, silently dismantling the victim's inner strength. Take, for instance, Sarah and Daniel. On the outside, their relationship appeared ideal, stable, calm, and comfortable. Friends and family admired Daniel's quiet composure and gentle demeanor. However, behind closed doors, something else entirely was unfolding. Daniel never raised his voice, never hurled insults or obvious criticisms. Instead, he communicated displeasure through an unsettling silence, a dismissive glance, or an almost imperceptible sigh whenever Sarah expressed her needs or shared her dreams. His subtlety was devastatingly effective. Gradually, Sarah began to censor herself, carefully choosing her words, constantly monitoring Daniel's reactions, and changing her behavior in hopes of avoiding his quiet disapproval. Months passed before Sarah realized that she felt perpetually anxious around Daniel, despite his outwardly calm demeanor. She couldn't pinpoint precisely when it started, only that her inner voice had become muffled and unsure. Each silent treatment, each withheld smile or nod of approval had eroded her confidence bit by bit until she questioned even the simplest decisions she made. Friends struggled to understand her distress. They saw only Daniel's quiet, agreeable exterior, never the invisible, intangible abuse taking place in their daily interactions. What makes ambient abuse so dangerously effective is its invisibility. Victims often second-guess their own experiences because there's rarely concrete proof, just a vague feeling of unease, confusion, and insecurity. The victim's emotional suffering remains hidden beneath the surface, unacknowledged by those around them. Without clear evidence, victims begin to internalize their confusion and anxiety, mistakenly believing they are overly sensitive, paranoid, or even emotionally unstable. Breaking free from ambient abuse requires understanding and identifying this subtle pattern of manipulation. It means recognizing that abuse isn't always loud or visible. It can also be quiet and deeply insidious. Awareness becomes essential, noticing those persistent feelings of unease, the inexplicable erosion of self-confidence, and the careful walking on eggshells existence that defines everyday life with an ambient abuser. Once identified, victims can reclaim their sense of self and begin to rebuild what has silently been taken from them. The first step is acknowledgement, trusting one's instincts and recognizing the validity of one's emotional experiences. Recovery means drawing clear boundaries, seeking outside perspectives, and reestablishing a solid foundation of self-belief. Ambient abuse may operate quietly in the shadows, but bringing it into the light removes its power. Awareness and recognition give victims the strength to step away from subtle cruelty and reclaim the freedom of living without the constant shadow of quiet psychological torment. Cold empathy. Empathy is usually seen as a warm, comforting quality, the ability to genuinely understand and connect with another person's emotional state. But there's another, darker side of empathy that's far less understood and infinitely more unsettling. It's called cold empathy, and rather than being motivated by care or compassion, it's fueled purely by self-interest, manipulation, and control. At its core, cold empathy refers to a narcissist's ability to recognize and understand the emotions of others without actually sharing or feeling those emotions. It's a chilling form of emotional intelligence, allowing the manipulator to carefully observe and dissect the emotional states of others with clinical precision. Instead of responding with genuine warmth, they use this emotional insight as a tool, a weapon, to subtly exploit, control, and dominate their victims. The chilling aspect of cold empathy is its duality. Narcissists who practice this tactic can appear remarkably caring, insightful, and emotionally attuned. They listen intently, ask thoughtful questions, and seem to genuinely understand the feelings of those around them. However, beneath this seemingly empathetic facade lies a calculated, detached intention. Their empathy is merely a strategic move, devoid of genuine warmth or compassion. Consider, for example, Kate and her relationship with Emma, her manager at work. Emma always seemed remarkably perceptive about Kate's emotions and struggles. She'd frequently notice when Kate was having a bad day, offering gentle words of understanding and seemingly supportive advice. On the surface, Emma seemed like a kind-hearted, attentive leader. But over time, Kate began to notice something unsettling. Each time Emma showed empathy, it seemed carefully timed to coincide with her own agenda. Whenever Emma sensed Kate's vulnerability, she'd subtly use that information against her. When Kate shared feelings of burnout, Emma acknowledged her exhaustion warmly, then promptly assigned her more work under the guise of helping her grow. Emma perfectly anticipated Kate's reluctance to disappoint, using her knowledge of Kate's emotional vulnerabilities to manipulate her into compliance. Her empathy was not genuine compassion, but a precise tool, coldly calculated and meticulously wielded. The true danger of cold empathy lies in its deceptive appearance. Victims are often completely unaware that they're being manipulated, precisely because the abuser convincingly mimics genuine emotional connection. The victim, craving emotional understanding, willingly reveals more and more of their inner world, unknowingly giving the narcissist an ever-expanding arsenal of emotional ammunition. Over time, victims of cold empathy start to feel subtly undermined and emotionally exhausted, though they're unable to pinpoint exactly why. They might even begin to question their own emotional responses, wondering if they've misinterpreted kindness or sensitivity. The confusion deepens their dependency, giving the narcissist even greater control and power. Escaping the grip of cold empathy requires becoming alert to the subtle disconnect between what a person says and what they do. Genuine empathy always leads toward authentic support and action, not exploitation. It's essential to recognize the patterns. Empathy consistently followed by demands, support followed by subtle undermining, warmth followed by exploitation. Understanding cold empathy shines a crucial spotlight on a disturbingly sophisticated psychological tactic. It reminds us that empathy, though usually a source of genuine human connection, can be weaponized when wielded by someone driven by manipulation and control. By recognizing the subtle but critical difference between genuine empathy and its chilling counterfeit, we protect ourselves from those who seek to exploit our vulnerability for their own cold-hearted gain. Silent conditioning. Most people think manipulation is loud, obvious, and confrontational, something easily spotted and challenged. But there's another kind, hidden in quiet moments and subtle actions, nearly impossible to detect until it has deeply shaped your behavior. This stealthy, insidious tactic is known as silent conditioning, and it's a psychological method narcissists frequently employ to gain control without ever raising their voice or openly dictating demands. Silent conditioning is the practice of quietly reinforcing certain behaviors in others through understated reactions such as selective silence, carefully timed withdrawal of attention, or subtle, nonverbal disapproval. Unlike overt manipulation, which involves clear-cut instructions or demands, silent conditioning teaches its lessons in whispers, through invisible rules quietly embedded into the fabric of a relationship. Here's how it works. A narcissist wants you to behave or react in a specific manner, but rather than directly stating their expectations, they subtly reward the desired behavior with smiles, warmth, and acceptance. Conversely, when you behave differently, they quietly punish you with silence, aloofness, or subtle signs of disappointment. Gradually, and without even realizing it, you begin to alter your behavior, driven by an unconscious urge to regain their approval. Before long, you've become conditioned, trained like a pet responding obediently to silent signals. Take, for instance, Maya and Lucas, who'd been dating for almost 2 years. Lucas rarely criticized Maya openly. Instead, he utilized silence as his chosen instrument of control. Whenever Maya expressed enthusiasm about her personal interests or hobbies, things Lucas didn't particularly care about, his reaction was subtly cold and disengaged. He'd remain distant, barely nodding, his expression blank and withdrawn. Soon, Maya felt compelled to downplay or abandon her interests entirely, hoping to regain Lucas's attention and warmth. Conversely, when Maya adapted herself to match Lucas's preferences, the reward was instantaneous yet subtle: a gentle smile, a reassuring nod, or a quiet, approving presence. Over time, this silent reinforcement reshaped Maya's personality, molding her into someone Lucas quietly approved of, someone who no longer authentically represented her own passions or interests. Maya never noticed the manipulation consciously. She simply felt an unsettling sense of relief whenever Lucas smiled approvingly, reinforcing her gradual shift toward behaviors he silently endorsed. The potency of silent conditioning lies precisely in its subtlety. Victims often have no idea they're being trained. Instead, they internalize the subtle praise or punishment, interpreting their emotional discomfort as personal flaws, never suspecting external manipulation. They convince themselves their adjusted behaviors are entirely their own choice, a sign of self-growth or compromise, rather than compliance driven by invisible pressures. This psychological tactic is dangerously effective because it works beneath awareness. Victims gradually accept diminished versions of themselves, becoming emotionally dependent on the manipulator's silent approval. Meanwhile, narcissists who practice silent conditioning gain absolute emotional dominance without ever appearing controlling or confrontational. They can easily deny any wrongdoing, painting themselves as supportive or patient, while quietly molding their target to fit their own desires. Breaking free from silent conditioning begins with awareness and self-reflection. Victims must identify the subtle pressures they've internalized and recognize the manipulator's quiet punishment and reward system. Once the invisible strings become visible, individuals can start reclaiming autonomy, consciously restoring their authentic selves, no longer beholden to another's silent expectations. Silent conditioning reminds us of a chilling truth. Manipulation isn't always loud and obvious. It often thrives silently, operating invisibly in the shadows of ordinary relationships. Recognizing this subtle control tactic empowers us to reclaim our voice, our identity, and our freedom from those who seek to silently shape us into their own image. Hoovering via proxy. Most people assume that once they break free from a manipulative relationship, they're finally safe from their former abuser's emotional games. Unfortunately, this assumption is dangerously naive. Narcissists often have another powerful tactic up their sleeves, something far subtler and more insidious than direct contact. This dark psychological trick is known as hoovering via proxy, a deceptive strategy designed to pull victims back into the toxic web through indirect manipulation. Hoovering itself refers to the narcissist's attempts to suck a former victim back into their orbit, named after the vacuum cleaner brand for its symbolic ability to pull people in against their will. But hoovering via proxy takes this method one sinister step further. Rather than directly approaching their victim, the narcissist uses a third party, a mutual friend, relative, or even an unsuspecting acquaintance, as their emotional puppet, passing messages, delivering sentimental reminders or subtly nudging the victim to reconsider leaving. This indirect approach makes the manipulation appear genuine, innocent, and detached, making it even harder for the victim to recognize or resist. Consider what happened to Emily after finally ending her tumultuous relationship with Ryan. Although she blocked him and consciously chose distance, Ryan didn't simply disappear. Instead, he quietly approached mutual friends, carefully framing himself as remorseful, wounded, and misunderstood. He spoke softly of how he missed Emily, claiming he had changed and was desperate for reconciliation. Ryan knew these carefully chosen messages would eventually find their way back to Emily through sympathetic third parties, gently eroding her resolve. One afternoon, Emily received a casual message from her friend Hannah. "Ryan really regrets how things ended. He asked about you the other day, saying how much he's changed. Maybe it wouldn't hurt to hear him out." Emily felt the familiar tug of empathy, confusion, and doubt. Her carefully built emotional barriers began to weaken. Was Ryan genuinely remorseful? Maybe she'd misjudged him. The indirect nature of Hannah's message made it seem harmless, innocent, even sincere. Emily couldn't immediately see that Hannah was being unwittingly manipulated by Ryan's hoovering via Proxy. She was merely a messenger, completely unaware that she was delivering carefully planned emotional bait. What makes hoovering via Proxy so effective is its subtlety and plausible deniability. The narcissist cleverly distances themselves from direct contact, making their victim less likely to suspect manipulation. Friends or family who relay these messages rarely realize they're being used as pawns. They believe they're simply helping or offering genuine support. Consequently, the victim feels guilty or hesitant about ignoring their advice or dismissing their concerns, making it all the easier for the narcissist to regain emotional leverage. Identifying this tactic involves paying close attention to indirect messages or pressure coming from friends, family, or mutual acquaintances after distancing yourself from a manipulator. If their conversations repeatedly circle back to the narcissist, especially framed sympathetically, it may signal a carefully orchestrated attempt at hoovering via Proxy. Resisting this manipulation means maintaining firm boundaries, even when indirect contact makes it difficult. It requires calmly but clearly communicating to friends and acquaintances that your decision is final and asking them to respect your emotional boundaries. Most importantly, recognizing the subtle nature of hoovering via Proxy helps victims realize they're not paranoid or overly sensitive. They're responding appropriately to covert emotional manipulation. In understanding hoovering via Proxy, we learn a disturbing yet essential truth about narcissistic manipulation. It doesn't always come directly from the abuser themselves. Sometimes it travels quietly through trusted faces, masked by genuine intentions. By seeing through this subtle tactic, victims can finally close the emotional door for good, protecting themselves from those who weaponize relationships, trust, and goodwill to continue their emotional domination from afar. Intermittent reinforcement. There is a particularly sinister way that manipulators and narcissists control their victims, one that's incredibly effective, yet almost impossible to detect at first glance. Unlike tactics that rely on open threats or obvious rewards, this psychological technique keeps people trapped precisely because it's inconsistent, unpredictable, and sporadic. It's known as intermittent reinforcement, and understanding it can mean the difference between emotional freedom and being trapped forever in a toxic relationship. Intermittent reinforcement is the psychological strategy of giving unpredictable and random rewards or punishments to keep a person in a constant state of anticipation. It's the uncertainty itself that's so powerfully addictive. Humans naturally crave consistency and predictability. When these are deliberately denied, individuals become obsessively focused on seeking out those brief and unpredictable moments of reward. Over time, This pattern can produce a state of intense emotional dependence, causing victims to become trapped in toxic relationships they desperately wish to leave. Picture this scenario. Alex was charming, passionate, and attentive when he first began dating Mia. He showered her with affection, compliments, and attention, making her feel uniquely special. However, as time passed, Alex's behavior subtly shifted. Gradually, his attention became unpredictable, oscillating wildly between warmth and cold indifference. Sometimes he'd vanish for days without explanation, only to return suddenly, offering affection and apologies as if nothing had happened. Mia never knew exactly what to expect, and instead of walking away, she became increasingly fixated on recapturing those fleeting moments of warmth. She convinced herself that the unpredictable affection was proof that deep down, Alex genuinely cared. Without realizing it, Mia had become a victim of intermittent reinforcement. Each unpredictable moment of kindness or affection from Alex flooded her brain with relief and pleasure, reinforcing the addictive craving for more. Her mind fixated on the uncertainty itself, desperately trying to decipher patterns in Alex's seemingly random behavior. As a result, Mia found herself trapped, clinging to occasional gestures of affection, unable to leave despite the overwhelming emotional toll of uncertainty. The dark brilliance of intermittent reinforcement is precisely that unpredictability. If rewards or punishments were consistent, people would quickly adapt. Consistent cruelty would prompt victims to leave, and consistent kindness would foster security and autonomy. By keeping victims guessing, manipulators ensure they remain fixated, endlessly waiting for the next good moment, the apology, the smile, the brief show of tenderness. This uncertain hope is precisely what makes intermittent reinforcement so dangerously powerful and emotionally debilitating. This tactic is so effective that it mirrors the psychological mechanics behind gambling addiction. Slot machines utilize intermittent reinforcement by offering random rewards at unpredictable intervals. Gamblers never know precisely when they'll win, so they keep playing, continually chasing that next potential reward. Similarly, victims of emotional manipulation become addicted to intermittent reinforcement because their emotional payoff arrives randomly, encouraging them to remain stuck in unhealthy situations. Breaking free from intermittent reinforcement begins with recognizing the pattern itself. Victims must acknowledge the addictive nature of unpredictable rewards and consciously resist the urge to chase after them, understanding that the brief moments of affection or approval aren't genuine, but calculated attempts to maintain control can help individuals regain their autonomy and emotional health. Intermittent reinforcement reveals a disturbing truth about emotional manipulation. It's not always cruelty or anger that keeps someone bound, but rather carefully calculated uncertainty. By grasping the psychology behind this subtle yet powerful technique, victims can finally break the addictive cycle, reclaim their self-worth, and escape the endless torment of unpredictability. Only then can they begin to rebuild their lives, free from the invisible chains that once held them captive. Preemptive gaslighting. Gaslighting is widely recognized as a powerful manipulation tactic used by narcissists to make victims doubt their perception of reality. But there's a more subtle, twisted variant of this tactic, one that's even more difficult to spot because it operates in reverse, attacking the victim's sense of credibility before they've even raised a concern. It's called preemptive gaslighting, a manipulative psychological weapon that enables abusers to silence their victims before they can speak, trapping them in a web of self-doubt, confusion, and emotional turmoil. In typical gaslighting scenarios, manipulators deny events, twist facts, or dismiss concerns after the victim challenges them. However, preemptive gaslighting strikes first, carefully planting doubts about the victim's perceptions before a conflict or confrontation occurs. The narcissist anticipates potential criticisms, accusations, or questions, and proactively cast doubt on the victim's memory, intentions, or sanity. By undermining the victim's credibility ahead of time, the narcissist prevents resistance, making their victim hesitant to trust their own judgment. Consider this scenario. Laura and Jake had been dating for a few months when Laura began noticing subtle inconsistencies in Jake's behavior, odd text messages, late-night disappearances, and increasingly frequent moments where Jake's explanations didn't quite add up. Before Laura could even confront Jake about her concerns, he carefully orchestrated a campaign of preemptive gaslighting. He started casually dropping comments into their conversations. You know, sometimes you get paranoid over nothing, or my ex used to overanalyze everything. It drove me away. Jake's words seemed harmless at first, almost empathetic, but the seed of doubt was planted firmly in Laura's mind. When Laura finally mustered the courage to ask Jake about his suspicious behavior, his groundwork paid off. "See, this is exactly what I meant," he sighed calmly. "You're being paranoid, imagining problems that don't exist." Because Jake had already suggested Laura was prone to paranoia, she immediately questioned her own perspective. Had she misread the situation? Was she genuinely overreacting? Jake's preemptive gaslighting successfully disarmed her, silencing her concerns before they were even fully voiced. What makes preemptive gaslighting especially sinister is its hidden effectiveness. By striking first and subtly undermining the victim's trust in their own perceptions, narcissists avoid direct conflict altogether. Their victims are left disoriented, uncertain, and hesitant to confront problems for fear of being labeled as overly sensitive or paranoid. This manipulation creates a perfect scenario for emotional control as victims become increasingly reliant on the narcissist to interpret their own reality. Victims of preemptive gaslighting often feel persistently confused and anxious, yet struggle to articulate why. They sense something is off, but they're continually second-guessing their feelings because their abuser has proactively framed their concerns as irrational. Over time, this leads victims to dismiss their instincts, eroding their confidence in their judgment and making it nearly impossible to hold their abuser accountable. Breaking free from preemptive gaslighting requires understanding how this subtle manipulation works and consciously reclaiming trust in one's perceptions. Victims must recognize that the doubts they feel about their own sanity and intuition have been intentionally planted. It involves carefully noting patterns of behavior, times when their legitimate concerns were dismissed even before voiced, and finding external validation through trusted friends, family, or professional counseling. Understanding preemptive gaslighting sheds light on a deeply disturbing yet masterful form of emotional abuse. By recognizing it, victims regain the power to trust themselves, break through the veil of confusion, and challenge the manipulator's carefully constructed illusions. Only then can they reclaim their voice and step out of the shadowy world created by those who seek to control them through doubt and deceit. Self-Victimizing Projection. Everyone knows someone who always seems to be the victim, no matter what happens. But there's a darker, lesser-known side to playing the victim, a cunning psychological trick favored by narcissists and manipulators that quietly shifts blame away from them while simultaneously painting their target as the aggressor. It's called self-victimizing projection, and understanding this tactic is essential if you want to protect yourself from emotional abuse that can leave you feeling confused, guilty, and isolated. Self-victimizing projection involves manipulators deliberately accusing their victims of harmful behaviors that the manipulator themselves is actually committing. But it doesn't stop there. They amplify this technique by dramatically portraying themselves as victims, generating sympathy and support from outsiders, while subtly turning friends, family, or co-workers against their true victim. The insidious power of this strategy lies in how convincingly the manipulator reverses roles, ensuring their victim feels guilt and shame for actions they never even committed. Imagine a scenario between coworkers Lisa and Sophie. Lisa is a charismatic yet deeply manipulative person, prone to gossiping and subtly undermining colleagues behind their backs. Sophie eventually notices Lisa's toxic behavior and confronts her privately, calmly expressing concerns about the harmful office environment Lisa is creating. Lisa's response is instantaneous and carefully calculated. She immediately bursts into tears, loudly claiming Sophie is bullying and victimizing her, twisting the confrontation into a dramatic scene of emotional distress. Soon after, Lisa quietly plants seeds of doubt among other colleagues, claiming Sophie has been relentlessly hostile toward her. Co-workers see Lisa's emotional performance and begin to comfort her, completely unaware of the truth behind Lisa's behavior. Sophie quickly finds herself isolated, viewed with suspicion, and deeply confused about how her genuine concerns have turned her into the villain. This scenario perfectly illustrates the dark brilliance of self-victimizing projection. Lisa successfully shifted the blame onto Sophie, gaining sympathy, while leaving Sophie emotionally isolated and uncertain of her own actions. Lisa is seen as the fragile victim, while Sophie, the true victim, is viewed suspiciously and critically. The manipulator's psychological strategy relies on their victim's natural tendency toward empathy and self-reflection. Honest, empathetic individuals tend to genuinely question themselves when accused, reflecting deeply to ensure they're not unintentionally harming others. Narcissists exploit this empathy, twisting it into a weapon. Victims internalize the accusations, worrying they've somehow behaved wrongly, even though deep down they sense something is off. The manipulator's confident self-portrayal as a victim further amplifies the confusion, leaving genuine victims isolated, doubting themselves, and emotionally trapped. Self-victimizing projection thrives on plausible deniability. The manipulator rarely provides clear evidence for their accusations, relying instead on emotional intensity and drama to convince bystanders. Because the accusations often seem vague yet emotionally charged, bystanders instinctively sympathize with the manipulator, leaving the real victim without support and thoroughly confused. Breaking free from self-victimizing projection requires understanding the tactic itself. Victims need to carefully document incidents, gathering concrete evidence of manipulation to defend themselves against unfounded accusations. Open communication with trusted, neutral parties can help restore perspective and counteract the manipulator's emotional theatrics. Crucially, victims must resist internalizing unwarranted guilt and firmly trust their perceptions of reality. Understanding self-victimizing projection illuminates one of the most emotionally manipulative strategies narcissists deploy. Recognizing it allows victims to reclaim their voice, counteract false narratives, and rebuild their self-esteem. By clearly seeing through this subtle yet devastating tactic, victims can finally break free from the emotional chains imposed by those who seek to portray themselves as perpetual victims while quietly destroying lives behind the scenes. Plausible deniability. There's a particular manipulation strategy that's as cunning as it is effective, one that allows abusers to evade accountability while leaving their victims bewildered, doubting their own perception and sanity. Known as plausible deniability, this tactic is a narcissist's secret weapon, an art form of subtle deceit, carefully engineered so the manipulator can always claim innocence, confusion, or misunderstanding when confronted. Plausible deniability involves executing manipulative actions in such subtle or ambiguous ways that when victims confront the manipulator, they're immediately met with confusion, innocent disbelief, or outright denial. Because the manipulator's actions are deliberately designed to leave room for doubt, no explicit proof, no clearly defined wrongdoing, they can convincingly deny any harmful intentions or wrongdoing. Victims who sense manipulation intuitively yet struggle to provide concrete proof, are left feeling confused, frustrated, and questioning their own perceptions. Consider Jenna, who's in a relationship with Adam. Adam consistently makes subtle, backhanded compliments about Jenna's appearance, intelligence, or choices, comments phrased gently enough to seem harmless, yet sharp enough to wound Jenna's confidence. When Jenna, deeply hurt, finally confronts Adam about these comments, his response is textbook plausible deniability. He looks genuinely shocked, gently shaking his head, and says with convincing sincerity, "I'm sorry you took it that way. I was genuinely trying to compliment you. I never meant it negatively." Because Adam's insults are masked as ambiguous remarks, Jenna struggles to identify the manipulation clearly. Each time she confronts him, Adam deflects easily, leaving her feeling overly sensitive, irrational, and increasingly isolated. Jenna begins to internalize her doubts, convincing herself she's imagining problems that aren't there. Meanwhile, Adam continues his emotional manipulation freely, protected by plausible deniability and his carefully cultivated image of innocence. This is the genius and cruelty of plausible deniability. It thrives on ambiguity, operating safely within gray areas of social interaction. Victims who instinctively sense manipulation find themselves unable to clearly articulate what happened, forced to doubt their own judgment. This psychological uncertainty slowly erodes their confidence, leaving them vulnerable, emotionally dependent, and hesitant to speak up again. Furthermore, plausible deniability isn't limited to personal relationships. In professional environments, a manipulative boss might subtly sabotage an employee's reputation by dropping vague insinuations during meetings, just ambiguous enough to raise doubts, yet not explicit enough to trigger direct confrontation. If challenged, the manipulative boss can feign surprise, innocently explaining away the misunderstanding, ensuring their victim appears paranoid or overly sensitive. The effectiveness of plausible deniability lies in how neatly it avoids accountability. The manipulator's vague, ambiguous behavior allows them to comfortably evade responsibility, while simultaneously undermining the victim's credibility. Because no direct proof exists, victims often question their perception, becoming increasingly hesitant to challenge the manipulator's version of reality. Breaking free from plausible deniability requires recognizing the pattern and understanding the manipulator's strategy. Victims must trust their instincts, documenting ambiguous incidents, noticing repeated patterns, and seeking validation from trusted, neutral sources who can offer unbiased perspectives. Ultimately, awareness of plausible deniability helps victims reclaim their clarity, trusting their intuition even when manipulation hides behind subtlety. Understanding plausible deniability exposes one of the most disturbingly effective psychological tactics manipulators employ. It shines a spotlight on how ambiguity itself can become a weapon, allowing abusers to quietly dismantle victims' confidence while maintaining an appearance of innocence. By clearly recognizing and understanding this subtle form of manipulation, victims regain the power to trust their perceptions, reclaim their reality, and finally break free from the invisible web of confusion woven by those who skillfully evade accountability. Reactive abuse. Imagine being quietly and subtly provoked day after day, hour after hour, until one day you finally snap. You raise your voice, react emotionally, or lash out just once in sheer frustration. At that exact moment, the manipulator calmly points a finger at you, declaring you unstable, aggressive, or even abusive. This carefully orchestrated scenario isn't accidental. It's a powerful psychological tactic called reactive abuse. Reactive abuse is a deceptive strategy employed by narcissists and other manipulators, involving the deliberate provocation of their victim into an emotional or angry reaction. The manipulator quietly prods, provokes, and undermines their victim repeatedly, carefully maintaining an outward facade of innocence or composure. Eventually, the victim, overwhelmed and emotionally exhausted, responds with frustration, anger, or distress. At precisely that moment, the manipulator exploits this emotional response as proof that the victim, not the manipulator, is the abusive, unstable, or toxic one. Take, for instance, Nicole and Sam. To their friends, Sam appears easygoing and patient, a likable guy who always seems reasonable. But behind closed doors, Sam quietly undermines Nicole, delivering carefully veiled insults, sarcastic remarks, or silent treatment designed to frustrate and destabilize her. For weeks, Nicole endures this subtle emotional torment, holding back her emotions, attempting to remain calm. Eventually, Sam's persistent provocations push her to her breaking point. Nicole finally explodes, yelling and crying in frustration, demanding answers from Sam about his cruel behavior. At that moment, Sam remains perfectly calm, deliberately projecting shock and hurt. He points at Nicole's emotional outburst as proof of her supposed instability. He calmly tells Nicole, "Look at how you're acting right now. I think you're the abusive one here." Sam's careful manipulation has succeeded. Nicole now believes that maybe she truly is the problem. Her emotional response, provoked and engineered by Sam, has been twisted into evidence against her. This chilling scenario perfectly illustrates the effectiveness of reactive abuse. The victim's natural, justified emotional reaction is deliberately misrepresented by the manipulator, making the victim appear irrational or unstable. Victims frequently internalize the blame, feeling guilt, shame, and confusion about their own emotional reactions, never realizing their responses were intentionally provoked by the manipulator's ongoing psychological torment. Reactive abuse thrives because it manipulates human empathy, self-doubt, and the innate desire to maintain emotional control. Victims typically question themselves deeply after emotional outbursts, replaying their reactions, wondering if perhaps they truly are unstable or abusive. Manipulators exploit this self-reflection, carefully reinforcing the false narrative that the victim is the actual aggressor. Further complicating matters, outsiders rarely see the manipulator's subtle provocations, only the victim's explosive reactions. This makes the victim appear abusive or erratic to others, isolating them from support networks and further strengthening the manipulator's control. Victims become trapped in cycles of guilt and confusion, hesitant to seek help or speak out, fearful they'll be misunderstood or labeled as unstable. Breaking free from reactive abuse requires first recognizing this tactic for what it truly is, a deliberate manipulation designed to provoke emotional reactions and discredit the victim. Victims must learn to trust their perceptions, acknowledging that their emotional reactions are legitimate responses to sustained emotional manipulation, documenting experiences, seeking external validation from trusted sources, and accessing professional help can significantly aid in reclaiming clarity and emotional strength. Understanding reactive abuse exposes a profoundly sinister aspect of psychological manipulation. It reveals how skilled manipulators twist genuine emotional pain into weapons used against their victims. By recognizing this disturbing tactic, victims can reclaim their emotional autonomy, reject the false narratives imposed upon them, and finally break free from the manipulator's invisible chains. Only then can they regain control of their emotional well-being, knowing their reactions were never the true source of the abuse. Epistemic injustice. There's a psychological trick so subtle yet destructive that it doesn't just manipulate emotions, it undermines a person's ability to trust their own knowledge, experiences, and judgment. Unlike more obvious forms of deception, this tactic quietly dismantles credibility itself, leaving the victim voiceless, powerless, and unsure of their reality. This insidious psychological technique is known as epistemic injustice. Epistemic injustice occurs when someone's experiences, perspectives, or truths are consistently dismissed, invalidated, or ignored simply because they're coming from that person. In essence, the victim is denied credibility as a knower or reliable source of information, not because they're incorrect, but because the manipulator subtly conditions others, and even the victim, to see them as fundamentally unreliable. Over time, this erodes the victim's self-trust, isolating them and diminishing their confidence in their own voice. Imagine Rachel, a junior executive at a prestigious firm. Rachel consistently noticed unethical practices conducted quietly by her senior colleagues. When she tried speaking up at meetings, calmly outlining concerns about transparency or integrity, her superiors skillfully deflected her observations, subtly questioning her experience, authority, or understanding. Comments like, "I appreciate your enthusiasm, Rachel, but you clearly don't understand the complexities here," or "You're not seeing the bigger picture," became frequent dismissals of her legitimate concerns. Gradually, colleagues began mirroring this subtle skepticism, doubting Rachel's judgment and expertise, even though her observations were accurate and insightful. Over time, Rachel herself began internalizing this doubt. She started hesitating before speaking up, second-guessing her insights, eventually convincing herself she might be misunderstanding situations entirely. Despite her original clarity, Rachel became silent and uncertain, effectively neutralized by epistemic injustice. This is the chilling power of epistemic injustice. It attacks the core foundation of a person's confidence in their own understanding. Victims are robbed of their authority and autonomy, systematically diminished and subtly convinced their experiences and perspectives hold little value. The manipulator doesn't simply silence the victim, they destroy their credibility, turning the victim's own voice against them. Epistemic injustice extends beyond personal relationships, impacting larger societal dynamics. Groups of people, women, minorities, or those lower in hierarchical positions often experience epistemic injustice on a systemic level. Their voices are subtly undermined, their experiences quietly dismissed, and their contributions consistently undervalued. Over time, entire groups internalize this lack of credibility, hesitating to trust their own experiences or speak openly about injustice. What makes epistemic injustice particularly dangerous is how invisible it can be. There are rarely overt insults or obvious criticisms, just subtle dismissals, gentle condescension, and careful deflections. Victims sense something deeply wrong, but struggle to articulate or prove exactly what's happening, causing them to internalize doubt and confusion. This deep uncertainty further entrenches their silence, ensuring continued control by those manipulating their credibility. Breaking free from epistemic injustice involves recognizing its subtle yet systematic presence. Victims must begin trusting their experiences again, reclaiming their authority as credible knowers. Seeking external validation from supportive, unbiased individuals or communities can also provide powerful reinforcement. Additionally, documenting experiences and confronting subtle dismissals directly, calmly, yet assertively helps victims reassert their credibility. Understanding epistemic injustice reveals one of the most disturbing methods manipulators use to maintain power. It highlights how effectively credibility itself can be weaponized, quietly dismantling victims' confidence and autonomy. By clearly identifying and confronting this subtle manipulation tactic, individuals can regain their voice, restore trust in their experiences, and dismantle the invisible barriers preventing their truths from being heard. Only then can they reclaim their rightful place as respected and credible contributors to their own lives and the broader community. Gray rock probing. Most people believe emotional manipulation requires visible conflict, dramatic arguments, or overt aggression. But there exists a far subtler psychological trick, one that lurks beneath the surface, quietly testing the limits of emotional defenses and patiently awaiting the smallest sign of vulnerability. Known as gray rock probing, this technique represents a sophisticated maneuver by narcissists designed specifically to break through a victim's emotional boundaries and regain control even after the victim attempts to emotionally detach. The gray rock method is a widely recognized strategy victims use to cope with narcissistic abuse. By becoming emotionally neutral, calm, indifferent, and utterly unresponsive to provocation, the victim mimics a gray rock, deliberately presenting nothing interesting or stimulating to the abuser. Ideally, this method bores the narcissist, prompting them to lose interest and seek emotional stimulation elsewhere. Yet, cunning manipulators have evolved a subtle counter tactic: gray rock probing. Gray rock probing is the narcissist's calculated response to their victim's emotional detachment. Rather than immediately responding with anger or overt hostility, the manipulator gently and persistently probes their victim's emotional defenses, seeking cracks in the neutral facade. They carefully attempt to elicit emotional reactions through subtle provocations, seemingly innocent questions, or unexpected kindness. The manipulator's objective isn't necessarily immediate control, but rather testing the victim's defenses, patiently waiting for the slightest emotional response to exploit. Consider Anna, who finally chose emotional detachment to cope with her toxic relationship with David. After years of emotional manipulation, Anna became determinedly neutral, giving only brief, bland responses to David's attempts at emotional provocation. Initially, David seemed frustrated, but soon his tactics shifted. He began gently probing Anna's neutrality, not with anger, but with carefully crafted emotional bait. He'd casually mention events or memories designed to trigger nostalgia, or subtly ask questions framed with faux concern. "Are you sure you're all right? You've seemed distant lately. I'm worried about you." David's gentle tone and feigned empathy gradually began to chip away at Anna's defenses. One day, she accidentally revealed a slight irritation during a minor exchange. David seized this subtle emotional reaction immediately, using it to portray Anna as unreasonable or overly sensitive. Anna was left feeling confused, doubting her ability to maintain neutrality. David's patient probing had successfully penetrated Anna's emotional shield, allowing him to regain a foothold of psychological control. Gray rock probing is particularly insidious because it masquerades as genuine concern, empathy, or innocent curiosity. Unlike overt aggression or hostility, this tactic leaves victims uncertain whether they're experiencing subtle manipulation or genuine emotional interaction. The ambiguity itself weakens their resolve, causing them to question their emotional detachment strategy and inadvertently become emotionally accessible again. Victims frequently underestimate the persistence and cunning of gray rock probing. Narcissists skilled in this tactic rarely show frustration openly, patiently waiting weeks or months, gently probing and subtly testing their victims' emotional boundaries. Their apparent patience masks cold calculation. They're simply waiting for any emotional slip-up, knowing eventually their victim will reveal vulnerability that can be exploited. Breaking free from gray rock, probing demands consistent awareness, vigilance, and determination. Victims must recognize that subtle emotional provocations, even those masked as kindness or concern, may represent calculated manipulations. Maintaining strict neutrality, consistently refusing emotional engagement, and consciously reinforcing emotional boundaries can significantly reduce vulnerability to this subtle probing tactic. Understanding gray rock. Probing exposes the disturbing subtlety and patience manipulative individuals exhibit when challenged by emotional detachment. Recognizing this tactic empowers victims to reinforce their emotional defenses, clearly identifying and neutralizing manipulative probes before they undermine emotional strength. Awareness of gray rock. Probing reminds victims of the importance of steadfast emotional boundaries, ultimately granting them the psychological clarity and strength necessary to break permanently free from subtle manipulation and regain control over their emotional lives. Isolation, cloaked as protection. There is a hidden manipulation tactic that's as cunning as it is dangerous, quietly wrapping itself in kindness and concern. It feels protective, even caring, yet beneath its comforting surface lies a sinister intent to isolate and control. Known as isolation cloaked as protection, this psychological maneuver is masterfully employed by narcissists who disguise their need to isolate their victims as genuine care, leaving the victim emotionally dependent, isolated, and completely vulnerable. Isolation cloaked as protection works through subtle manipulation of the victim's trust. Rather than openly forbidding friendships or relationships, the narcissist gently convinces their victim that others are harmful, untrustworthy, or simply do not have their best interests at heart. They frame this manipulation as sincere concern, claiming their actions are purely motivated by love, safety, or protection. Over time, this false sense of security quietly dismantles the victim's emotional support networks, leaving them entirely dependent on the manipulator. Picture Sarah and James. Early in their relationship, James showered Sarah with attention, affection, and protective concern. When Sarah mentioned spending time with friends or family, James gently expressed worry, subtly suggesting Sarah's friends were not supportive or genuinely caring. "I don't think your friend Sophie has your best interests at heart," he'd softly remark. "You deserve friends who truly value you, someone like me." Initially, Sarah dismissed these gentle warnings, but James consistently framed them as sincere concern. Gradually, Sarah began internalizing James's viewpoint, unconsciously distancing herself from previously supportive relationships. Whenever Sarah planned outings, James expressed soft concern about her safety, emotional well-being, or suggested subtle criticisms about her friends' intentions. "I worry about you when you're with them," he'd say gently. "I just want to protect you." Because James appeared genuinely caring, Sarah slowly accepted his perspective, unaware she was becoming increasingly isolated from friends, family, and outside support. The insidious power of isolation cloaked as protection lies in how convincingly it masquerades as genuine care. Victims rarely recognize their growing isolation as intentional. They genuinely believe their manipulator is simply looking out for them. By subtly encouraging doubt about outside relationships, narcissists ensure their victims voluntarily withdraw from other emotional supports. Over time, victims become emotionally dependent on the manipulator, lacking alternative perspectives or external validation. This dependence significantly strengthens the manipulator's emotional control, trapping victims in a psychological prison they willingly enter. Isolation cloaked as protection thrives precisely because it weaponizes human trust and empathy. Victims naturally seek genuine connection, support, and emotional safety. Manipulators exploit these fundamental human needs, framing their subtle control as heartfelt care and protective love. Victims rarely suspect malice behind such seemingly sincere concern. Instead, they willingly distance themselves from others, believing they're making wise choices for their emotional well-being. Unaware, they're quietly surrendering emotional autonomy. Breaking free from this subtle manipulation requires recognizing isolation cloaked as protection for what it truly is, a carefully orchestrated control tactic. Victims must actively examine their relationships, noticing whether isolation from others has occurred subtly under the guise of concern. Seeking external validation from trusted individuals outside the manipulator's influence can help restore clarity, allowing victims to reassess relationships and reestablish emotional connections. Understanding isolation cloaked as protection exposes one of the most disturbingly subtle tactics manipulators employ to achieve emotional dominance. By clearly seeing through this manipulative illusion of genuine concern, victims regain their emotional freedom, reclaim their connections with friends and family, and rebuild their trust in their perceptions. Recognizing isolation cloaked as protection empowers individuals to escape the quiet emotional imprisonment orchestrated by manipulators, finally breaking the chains of subtle control disguised as sincere love. Weaponized neglect. Neglect is often mistaken as mere indifference or accidental oversight, easily dismissed as harmless or unintentional. Yet there's a darker, far more deliberate form of neglect, a coldly calculated psychological strategy that's purposely wielded like a weapon. Known as weaponized neglect, this tactic is expertly used by narcissists and manipulators to control, punish, and emotionally torment their victims, all while hiding behind the mask of passive innocence. Weaponized neglect occurs when a manipulator deliberately withholds emotional support, affection, attention, or basic consideration, not out of genuine indifference, but as a conscious method of asserting dominance and control. Unlike overt aggression or clear emotional abuse, weaponized neglect operates quietly beneath the surface, subtle enough to avoid detection, yet devastatingly effective in dismantling the victim's self-worth and emotional stability. The neglect is carefully calibrated, enough to cause emotional distress, but subtle enough to evade clear accusations of wrongdoing. Consider the relationship between Emma and Liam. Early on, Liam showered Emma with love and affection, making her feel deeply valued and secure. But as their relationship progressed, Liam slowly introduced weaponized neglect. He began selectively ignoring Emma's emotional needs, subtly withdrawing affection, attention, and support whenever he felt displeased. If Emma voiced concerns or raised emotional issues, Liam responded not with direct conflict, but with quiet detachment. He withheld conversations, affection, and reassurance, leaving Emma isolated in her emotional distress. Emma was initially confused, wondering if Liam's emotional withdrawal was accidental or misunderstood. However, over time, she sensed a troubling pattern. Each time she disagreed with Liam or sought emotional connection during difficult moments, he quietly punished her through calculated neglect. Emma's needs went unmet, her emotional wounds unnoticed. Liam never openly acknowledged his actions, easily dismissing Emma's concerns with innocent confusion or feigned misunderstanding. Yet Emma's growing emotional desperation was undeniable, leaving her constantly striving for Liam's withheld affection and validation. The insidious power of weaponized neglect lies in its plausible deniability. The manipulator rarely appears openly hostile or overtly cruel, instead carefully hiding behind silence, detachment, or minimal interactions. Victims often find themselves unable to pinpoint exactly why they feel so emotionally drained, neglected, and desperate. They question their own perception, wondering if they're simply imagining neglect or overreacting emotionally. Over time, victims internalize blame, believing their emotional distress is due to their inadequacies rather than intentional manipulation. Weaponized neglect exploits the victim's fundamental human need for connection and validation. By deliberately withholding emotional responsiveness, the manipulator creates a powerful craving within their victim for attention, support, and affirmation. This craving reinforces emotional dependency, subtly ensuring the victim continually seeks approval from the neglectful abuser. Because the neglect appears passive and unintentional, victims rarely suspect deliberate harm, often mistakenly believing they're responsible for their emotional pain. Breaking free from weaponized neglect demands recognizing it as a deliberate control tactic rather than accidental oversight. Victims must identify clear patterns of emotional withdrawal linked directly to conflicts or emotional needs expressed to the manipulator, building external support networks, seeking independent validation from friends or counselors, and consciously reestablishing emotional boundaries are crucial steps toward reclaiming emotional autonomy and self-worth. Understanding weaponized neglect exposes one of the darkest forms of subtle emotional manipulation. It reveals how neglect itself, often dismissed as harmless or accidental, can be strategically employed to achieve profound emotional control. Recognizing this manipulation tactic allows victims to regain trust in their emotional perceptions, break the cycle of dependency created by intentional neglect, and restore emotional strength and autonomy. Only by confronting the disturbing reality of weaponized neglect can victims finally reclaim the emotional freedom deliberately withheld by those who seek control through silent, calculated cruelty. Guilt by omission. There's an unsettling psychological tactic so subtle it operates silently, hidden within the spaces between words, the truths left unsaid, the explanations carefully withheld. It quietly plants seeds of doubt and confusion, making victims feel guilty and uncertain without even fully understanding why. Known as guilt by omission, this sinister manipulation strategy thrives precisely because it's invisible, relying not on explicit accusations or overt criticism, but on strategic silence and calculated withholding of information. Guilt by omission occurs when a manipulator deliberately withholds critical information, explanations, or reassurance, creating an emotional vacuum filled by the victim's self-doubt and guilt. Rather than openly accusing or confronting the victim, the manipulator remains silent, passive, or elusive, leaving the victim to fill in these blank spaces with their own anxious speculations and insecurities. Over time, this method deeply undermines the victim's emotional stability, creating intense feelings of guilt, self-blame, and confusion, often without the victim ever realizing they've been manipulated at all. Consider an example involving Mia and Alex. Alex never openly criticized Mia, nor did he directly accuse her of wrongdoing. Instead, whenever Mia expressed uncertainty or anxiety about their relationship, Alex would quietly become distant, withholding emotional reassurances, explanations, or even basic acknowledgments of her concerns. His responses were always vague, incomplete, or subtly dismissive. Mia soon found herself feeling anxious, guilty, and emotionally isolated, assuming she'd unintentionally upset or harmed Alex in some unknown way. Because Alex never clearly communicated his emotions or thoughts, Mia filled the emotional silence with her own internal assumptions and self-doubt. She began analyzing her every action, carefully examining their interactions for imagined offenses or mistakes. Gradually, Mia internalized a deep sense of guilt and inadequacy, despite Alex never explicitly accusing her of anything. His careful omission of reassurance or explanation effectively made Mia blame herself, ensuring emotional control without Alex needing to openly criticize or confront her. The chilling effectiveness of guilt by omission lies precisely in this ambiguity. Victims rarely recognize they're experiencing deliberate manipulation because there's no direct confrontation, clear accusation, or explicit hostility. Instead, the victim's mind naturally seeks explanations for the emotional silence and lack of reassurance, inevitably landing on self-blame and guilt. Manipulators exploit this human tendency, ensuring victims willingly assume responsibility for the emotional vacuum created by their calculated silence. Furthermore, guilt by omission often operates effectively in professional settings. Imagine a scenario where an employee consistently seeks guidance or feedback from their manager. The manager, rather than providing constructive feedback, deliberately withholds clarity, offering only vague, ambiguous responses. The employee, desperate for approval, internalizes anxiety assuming they're underperforming or inadequate. The manager never explicitly criticizes the employee, yet the carefully omitted guidance and reassurance fosters deep insecurity, guilt, and self-doubt, ensuring continued dependency and control. Breaking free from guilt by omission requires recognizing the tactic's subtlety and intentional nature. Victims must actively question emotional silences or withheld information, demanding clarity and clear communication. Refusing to internalize guilt without explicit explanation helps counteract the manipulation, establishing clear emotional boundaries, seeking external validation, and consciously refusing to accept ambiguous silence as evidence of wrongdoing significantly weaken the manipulator's power. Understanding guilt by omission shines a revealing light on the subtle, insidious nature of emotional manipulation. It demonstrates that manipulation isn't always loud, confrontational, or explicit. Sometimes it's entirely silent, hidden within careful omissions, calculated silences, and subtle evasions. By recognizing and clearly understanding this quiet but powerful psychological tactic, victims can reclaim emotional clarity, refuse unwarranted guilt, and ultimately break free from manipulation rooted in strategic silence and omission. Only then can they fully restore their emotional autonomy and reject the silent control imposed by manipulative silence. Double binding compliments. There's a uniquely twisted psychological tactic, elegant in its cruelty, subtle yet devastatingly effective, one that traps its victims in confusion, frustration, and anxiety without ever raising suspicion. This manipulative technique is known as double binding compliments. At first glance, they seem innocent, even flattering, but beneath the surface lies a hidden trap, quietly undermining self-esteem and emotional stability, leaving victims questioning themselves without fully understanding why. Double binding compliments involve offering praise or approval that's deliberately coupled with criticism or subtle negativity. On the surface, these remarks appear supportive, thoughtful, and sincere, yet their true purpose is to confuse the victim, creating a psychological double bind, a scenario where the victim feels simultaneously rewarded and punished. The manipulator's praise validates, while the subtle criticism creates anxiety, uncertainty, and insecurity. Victims become trapped, unsure how to respond, and internally conflicted about how they should feel. Consider Claire and Ethan. Ethan regularly offered Claire seemingly supportive compliments, but each came subtly laced with doubt or criticism. One evening, Claire proudly presented a painting she'd spent weeks creating. Ethan carefully examined it and said warmly, "It looks great. You must have really worked hard. Honestly, I'm surprised. It turned out better than I thought you could manage." His smile felt genuine, his tone approving, yet Claire was instantly conflicted. Was she supposed to feel proud or insulted? Another time, after Claire received a promotion at work, Ethan hugged her affectionately, saying, "Congratulations. I'm really impressed they chose you. Considering your limited experience, that's quite an accomplishment." Each compliment Ethan offered was carefully designed to praise and subtly undermine at once, leaving Claire confused, emotionally vulnerable, and increasingly reliant on Ethan's approval. The chilling effectiveness of double binding compliments lies precisely in their psychological ambiguity. Victims rarely recognize manipulation, instead experiencing conflicted emotions, gratitude and anxiety, pride and shame, without understanding why. The dual message embedded within each compliment traps victims emotionally, ensuring they continually seek reassurance and validation from their manipulator, who deliberately withholds genuine clarity or unconditional praise. Double binding compliments exploit fundamental human desires, our deep need for approval, validation, and emotional security. Victims become desperate to win the manipulator's genuine approval, yet remain uncertain how to do so. The simultaneous presence of praise and subtle criticism ensures victims are perpetually anxious, always striving to meet ambiguous, ever-shifting standards. Over time, victims internalize these contradictions, consistently doubting their abilities and accomplishments, becoming increasingly emotionally dependent. This manipulative tactic thrives especially within personal relationships, professional environments, or family dynamics. A manager may praise an employee's innovative idea while subtly hinting it's overly ambitious or unrealistic, leaving the employee anxious yet grateful. A parent might lovingly compliment a child's achievement, quietly remarking it was impressive considering their typically careless behavior. Each carefully calculated remark creates uncertainty, self-doubt, and emotional dependency. Breaking free from double-binding compliments demands clear recognition of their subtle psychological manipulation. Victims must consciously separate praise from subtle criticism, recognizing their emotional conflict is intentionally created, seeking external validation, developing independent confidence, and confronting manipulative remarks calmly yet assertively can significantly weaken this manipulative tactic. Refusing emotional entrapment within ambiguous praise helps restore self-esteem and autonomy. Understanding double-binding compliments exposes a disturbingly sophisticated psychological tactic. It demonstrates how skillfully manipulators exploit human emotional needs, trapping victims within subtle contradictions. Recognizing this manipulation tactic empowers victims to reclaim emotional clarity, reject deliberate ambiguity, and ultimately break free from emotional dependence. By clearly understanding double-binding compliments, victims restore confidence in their abilities and regain emotional independence, rejecting the carefully constructed confusion and anxiety imposed by manipulative praise. Dosed affection. There's a psychological tactic so deceptively subtle, yet devastatingly effective, it quietly reshapes relationships without ever sounding an alarm. It operates through careful manipulation of love, affection, and emotional attention, deliberately rationing these critical emotional resources to create intense dependency, confusion, and longing in victims. Known as dosed affection, this sinister manipulation tactic involves giving affection, validation, or emotional warmth sparingly and unpredictably, ensuring the victim becomes desperately addicted to these carefully controlled moments of intimacy. Dosed affection is fundamentally different from healthy emotional interactions. Genuine relationships consistently offer affection, reassurance, and emotional validation, providing stability, confidence, and emotional security. However, manipulators utilizing dosed affection deliberately provide these emotional experiences irregularly, carefully controlling their frequency and intensity. They ration affection like precious currency, delivering brief moments of emotional warmth followed by extended periods of cold indifference. Over time, victims become emotionally addicted, desperately craving affection, yet perpetually uncertain when, or even if, they'll receive it. Imagine Hannah and Marcus. Early in their relationship, Marcus showered Hannah with abundant affection and attention, creating intense emotional intimacy. Gradually, Marcus shifted his behavior, carefully rationing his affection. For days, Marcus would remain cold and emotionally detached, offering Hannah only minimal attention or warmth. Then, suddenly, without warning, Marcus would dramatically provide affectionate attention, passionately expressing love and admiration. Each unpredictable moment of affection overwhelmed Hannah with relief and pleasure, leaving her desperately grateful and emotionally dependent. During Marcus's periods of coldness, Hannah found herself anxious and emotionally desperate, questioning herself, wondering what she had done wrong. Each time Marcus finally provided affection, Hannah's relief reinforced her emotional dependency, ensuring she remained trapped in a constant cycle of emotional uncertainty. The disturbing power of dosed affection lies precisely in its unpredictability. Manipulators carefully control when emotional rewards are provided, ensuring victims remain constantly anxious yet hopeful. Victims experience intense emotional craving during periods of neglect, desperately longing for the manipulator's unpredictable affection. This emotional roller coaster significantly intensifies dependency, compelling victims to constantly adjust their behavior, hoping desperately to trigger their manipulator's withheld affection. Moreover, dosed affection operates similarly to addictive substances or gambling behaviors. Random emotional rewards powerfully reinforce dependency, ensuring victims remain emotionally addicted, constantly chasing the manipulator's carefully rationed affection. Manipulators deliberately exploit human psychology, ensuring victims willingly remain trapped in emotionally destructive relationships, unable to escape the addictive emotional cycle. Breaking free from dosed affection requires victims to clearly recognize this tactic's manipulative nature. Victims must acknowledge that genuine affection isn't conditional, rational, or unpredictable. True emotional intimacy involves consistent emotional support and stability, establishing clear emotional boundaries, actively seeking external validation and emotional support, and consciously refusing emotional dependency significantly weakens this manipulative tactic. Victims should consciously question emotional relationships defined by unpredictable affection, carefully examining the emotional consistency and reliability of their partner's behavior. Recognizing emotional addiction helps victims regain emotional autonomy, consciously rejecting relationships defined by calculated emotional manipulation. Understanding dosed affection exposes one of the most disturbingly subtle forms of psychological manipulation. It demonstrates how effectively manipulators exploit basic human emotional needs, deliberately creating intense dependency through unpredictable affection. Recognizing this manipulative tactic empowers victims to reclaim emotional independence, confidently establishing healthy relationships based on genuine emotional consistency and stability. By clearly understanding dosed affection, victims break free from emotionally manipulative relationships, consciously reclaiming emotional strength, autonomy, and stability. Only then can they truly experience genuine emotional intimacy, free from manipulative emotional games defined by deliberately rationed affection. Love withdrawal. There exists a psychological tactic so emotionally devastating, yet quietly executed, it leaves no visible bruises or scars. Instead, it leaves deep emotional wounds, profound confusion, and intense feelings of insecurity. Known as love withdrawal, this subtle yet sinister manipulation strategy involves deliberately withholding love, affection, and emotional intimacy as punishment, control, or emotional leverage, leaving victims feeling abandoned, emotionally starved, and desperately craving acceptance and reassurance. Love withdrawal is uniquely powerful because it directly exploits one of humanity's deepest emotional needs, the fundamental desire to be loved, valued, and emotionally connected. Unlike open hostility or aggressive confrontation, love withdrawal involves quietly and strategically removing affection, emotional warmth, and validation, deliberately punishing the victim through emotional abandonment. Victims feel emotionally rejected, deeply anxious, and intensely desperate to regain withheld love and acceptance, creating profound emotional dependency and control. Imagine Julia and Ben. Early in their relationship, Ben showered Julia with affection, attention, and emotional intimacy, making her feel deeply valued and secure. Gradually, whenever Ben felt displeased or disagreed with Julia, he began quietly withdrawing affection, carefully withholding intimacy, emotional warmth, and reassurance as subtle punishment. Rather than openly addressing conflicts, Ben used silent, emotional withdrawal, ensuring Julia felt emotionally abandoned whenever she failed to meet his expectations. Each time Ben withdrew love and affection, Julia was overwhelmed by anxiety and confusion, desperately questioning herself, wondering what she'd done wrong. She found herself becoming increasingly anxious, carefully adjusting her behavior and constantly seeking reassurance to regain Ben's withheld affection. Whenever Ben finally restored emotional warmth, Julia felt intense emotional relief and gratitude, reinforcing her emotional dependency and ensuring continued emotional control. The disturbing effectiveness of love withdrawal lies precisely in its subtlety and emotional intensity. Victims rarely recognize emotional withdrawal as intentional manipulation, often mistakenly believing they're genuinely responsible for their emotional abandonment. The subtle, quiet nature of emotional withdrawal ensures victims internalize blame, anxiety, and insecurity, becoming increasingly emotionally dependent on the manipulator's withheld love. Moreover, love withdrawal frequently occurs in family dynamics, profoundly impacting children's emotional development. Parents who use emotional withdrawal deliberately withhold love, validation, and affection as punishment for perceived failures or misbehavior. Children internalize profound emotional insecurity, desperately seeking approval, emotional warmth, and reassurance, ensuring continued emotional dependency and control long into adulthood. Love withdrawal profoundly damages victims' emotional stability, causing intense emotional anxiety, insecurity, and fear of abandonment. Victims experience profound confusion, unable to articulate precisely why they feel emotionally devastated, abandoned, or anxious. They frequently internalize emotional abandonment, blaming themselves for withheld love and affection, ensuring profound emotional dependency. Breaking free from love withdrawal requires clear recognition of emotional withdrawal as deliberate emotional manipulation rather than genuine emotional response. Victims must consciously separate emotional dependency from withheld love, clearly establishing emotional boundaries and consciously refusing emotional manipulation. Seeking external validation, emotional support, and professional counseling significantly aids victims in reclaiming emotional autonomy and stability. Victims should consciously question emotional relationships defined by emotional withdrawal, carefully examining patterns of emotional abandonment and withholding affection. Recognizing emotional manipulation helps victims consciously reclaim emotional stability, confidently refusing emotional dependency and manipulation. Understanding love withdrawal exposes one of the most disturbingly subtle and emotionally damaging forms of psychological manipulation. It demonstrates how effectively manipulators exploit basic human emotional needs, deliberately creating intense emotional dependency through calculated emotional abandonment. Recognizing emotional withdrawal empowers victims to reclaim emotional independence, confidently establishing healthy emotional boundaries and consciously rejecting emotional manipulation. By clearly understanding love withdrawal, victims consciously break free from emotionally manipulative relationships, reclaiming emotional stability, autonomy, and genuine emotional intimacy. Only then can victims genuinely experience emotional connection, affection, and validation, free from deliberate emotional abandonment and manipulation. Bait and switch personality. Imagine meeting someone who instantly feels perfect. They seem warm, attentive, and genuinely caring, everything you've ever wanted. Your connection feels almost magical, and you quickly fall into an intense, seemingly ideal relationship. But then, subtly and without warning, something changes. That charming personality you fell for begins shifting, leaving you confused, hurt, and emotionally disoriented. You've unknowingly become a victim of the manipulative, psychological tactic known as the bait and switch personality. Bait and switch personality is a tactic often employed by narcissists and emotional manipulators. Initially, the manipulator presents an exaggeratedly positive, affectionate, and caring persona, the bait. Their charm is irresistible, carefully crafted to draw you into an emotionally intense relationship. They mirror your desires, values, and dreams, appearing as your perfect match. Once you're emotionally invested, comfortable, and deeply attached, the manipulator quietly replaces their charming persona with something far less pleasant, the switch. At first, the changes seem small and easy to overlook. Perhaps they're less attentive, less affectionate, or subtly critical. You rationalize these behaviors, attributing them to stress or fatigue. Gradually, the shift becomes more pronounced. Affection transforms into cold indifference. Praise turns into subtle criticism, and support becomes emotional neglect or manipulation. Yet because you vividly remember the charming, affectionate person they once appeared to be, you desperately cling to memories, convinced their previous warmth and affection will soon return. Consider Jessica and Mark. When they first met, Mark seemed like Jessica's perfect match, thoughtful, romantic, and deeply attentive. Jessica felt intensely loved and emotionally supported, convinced she'd finally found the one. But shortly after they moved in together, Mark's behavior subtly shifted. His previously affectionate personality became distant, detached, and subtly critical. Jessica initially blamed herself, assuming she'd done something wrong or failed Mark in some mysterious way. As months passed, Mark's behavior worsened, becoming increasingly critical, emotionally withdrawn, and manipulative. Yet whenever Jessica confronted him about these changes, Mark masterfully deflected, claiming she was overreacting or imagining things. Jessica felt emotionally trapped, unable to reconcile the charming man she'd initially fallen in love with and the cold, emotionally distant person he'd quietly become. The chilling power of bait and switch personality lies precisely in this psychological confusion. Victims vividly remember the manipulator's initial charm and affection, making it nearly impossible to accept their present emotional reality. They desperately rationalize manipulative behaviors, hoping the person they first fell in love with will eventually return. Manipulators exploit this emotional hope, skillfully alternating between emotional warmth and emotional detachment, keeping victims emotionally off balance and profoundly dependent. Bait and switch personality profoundly undermines emotional stability and self-worth, causing victims deep emotional anxiety, confusion, and insecurity. Victims frequently internalize blame, assuming they must be responsible for the manipulator's changing behavior. Over time, this self-blame creates profound emotional dependency, ensuring victims remain emotionally trapped, continually seeking withheld affection and validation. Breaking free from bait and switch personality demands victims clearly recognize the tactic as deliberate emotional manipulation rather than accidental emotional shifts. Victims must actively separate their idealized memories from their emotional reality, carefully examining patterns of emotional inconsistency and manipulation, establishing clear emotional boundaries, seeking external validation, emotional support, and professional counseling significantly helps victims reclaim emotional autonomy and stability. Understanding bait and switch personality exposes one of the most disturbingly subtle psychological manipulation strategies. It demonstrates how effectively manipulators exploit emotional attachment, deliberately creating intense emotional dependency through carefully crafted emotional inconsistency. Recognizing bait and switch personality empowers victims to reclaim emotional independence, confidently establishing healthy emotional boundaries and consciously rejecting emotional manipulation. By clearly understanding bait and switch personality, victims consciously break free from emotionally manipulative relationships, reclaiming emotional stability, autonomy, and genuine emotional intimacy. Only then can victims genuinely experience emotional connections, affection, and validation, free from calculated emotional deceit and manipulation. Identity erosion. At first glance, identity erosion might seem too subtle, too quiet, or too ambiguous to truly be considered a form of manipulation. Yet, it's precisely this subtlety that makes it devastatingly effective. Identity erosion is a psychological tactic employed by narcissists and emotional manipulators, designed to gradually chip away at a person's sense of self, leaving them vulnerable, dependent, and stripped of autonomy. Unlike overt criticism or direct hostility, this manipulation method slowly dismantles a person's identity piece by piece, carefully undermining confidence, weakening boundaries, and leaving victims deeply unsure of who they truly are. Identity erosion occurs when a manipulator subtly but systematically invalidates, dismisses, or overrides the victim's personal values, preferences, dreams, and interests. Over time, victims lose their ability to trust their instincts and decisions, becoming reliant on the manipulator for validation and direction. The goal isn't merely control, it's a complete reshaping of the victim's identity into someone easier to dominate and manipulate. Consider Sarah and Tom. Early in their relationship, Tom was deeply attentive and affectionate, seemingly supportive of Sarah's independence and ambitions. However, gradually Tom began subtly undermining Sarah's choices, preferences, and interests. Initially, his remarks were gentle, yet subtly critical. If Sarah enjoyed a particular hobby, Tom would smile softly but say something dismissive like, "It's nice you enjoy that, but don't you think it's a bit childish?" When Sarah expressed opinions about work or future goals, Tom subtly questioned her judgment or abilities, always framing his criticism as gentle advice or genuine concern. Slowly but steadily, Sarah internalized Tom's gentle criticisms. She quietly abandoned hobbies, changed her opinions to align with Tom's, and gradually adopted his preferences, values, and dreams as her own. Sarah convinced herself these changes were natural, necessary compromises for their relationship's growth. Yet, internally, Sarah began feeling profoundly disconnected, lost, and anxious, unable to identify clearly who she truly was or what she genuinely valued anymore. The sinister brilliance of identity erosion lies precisely in its quiet, incremental nature. Manipulators rarely overtly attack a victim's identity. Instead, they gently, repeatedly, and subtly undermine it. Victims don't lose themselves immediately. Rather, they quietly surrender their autonomy and identity, one tiny piece at a time. This gradual erosion ensures victims rarely notice their identity disappearing until they wake up feeling profoundly lost, uncertain, and emotionally dependent. Identity erosion exploits the natural human desire for acceptance, belonging, and validation. Victims naturally crave emotional intimacy, connection, and approval. Manipulators deliberately weaponize this need, gently but consistently invalidating victims' identities and subtly reshaping them into a reflection of their own desires and preferences. Over time, victims become increasingly emotionally dependent, desperate for approval, validation, and direction, ensuring continued emotional dominance and control by the manipulator. Breaking free from identity erosion demands clear recognition of its manipulative nature. Victims must actively question the authenticity of their own identity, carefully examining if changes genuinely reflect their values or simply result from emotional manipulation. Reclaiming emotional autonomy involves actively reconnecting with genuine personal interests, preferences, values, and dreams, consciously refusing to allow external validation to define identity. External emotional support and counseling significantly help victims restore clarity, autonomy, and emotional independence. understanding identity, Erosion exposes one of the most disturbingly subtle yet profoundly damaging psychological tactics. It demonstrates how effectively manipulators exploit emotional vulnerability, deliberately dismantling a victim's identity to establish complete emotional control. Recognizing this manipulation tactic empowers victims to reclaim emotional autonomy, consciously refusing emotional manipulation and rediscovering authentic identity. By clearly understanding identity erosion, victims consciously break free from emotionally manipulative relationships, reclaim emotional clarity, autonomy, and genuine identity. Only then can victims genuinely experience emotional connection, intimacy, and personal fulfillment, free from deliberate emotional dismantling and subtle manipulation. Triangulation through praise. Picture this. Your partner casually praises someone else, perhaps a friend, colleague, or even a stranger, for qualities you've always admired or aspired to. Their tone is innocent, even friendly, yet you feel an unexpected pang of insecurity, jealousy, or inadequacy. Before you can articulate why, you find yourself wondering if you measure up, suddenly competing with someone who wasn't even on your radar moments before. This subtle yet deeply unsettling feeling isn't accidental. It's a carefully calculated psychological tactic known as triangulation through praise. Triangulation through praise is a manipulative method frequently employed by narcissists to establish control, incite jealousy, and undermine their victims' self-esteem. Rather than openly criticizing or directly confronting their victim, the manipulator strategically praises a third party, deliberately highlighting qualities they believe their victim lacks or deeply desires. The goal isn't merely admiration of someone else, it's to create emotional insecurity, anxiety, and a desperate drive for the victim to compete and regain approval. Take, for instance, Hannah and Alex. Whenever Hannah voiced her opinions or achievements, Alex listened politely, but remained noticeably neutral. Yet later, in casual conversations, Alex would subtly praise mutual acquaintances, emphasizing qualities Hannah secretly admired or doubted within herself. He might warmly comment, "Did you notice how insightful Jessica was at dinner? She always seems to understand things deeply." Knowing Hannah often felt uncertain about expressing herself effectively. Another time, when Hannah shared news of her promotion at work, Alex smiled but quickly shifted focus, casually mentioning another colleague's seemingly more impressive career achievement. "You know, it's remarkable how quickly Emma climbed the ladder at her firm. She's got incredible determination," he'd say gently, with genuine seeming admiration. Each carefully placed compliment planted seeds of insecurity, subtly encouraging Hannah to question her own worth, accomplishments, and qualities. The chilling effectiveness of triangulation through praise lies in its subtlety and plausible innocence. Victims rarely immediately suspect intentional manipulation, initially viewing praise of others as genuinely innocent or even supportive. Yet each instance quietly erodes self-esteem, creating emotional uncertainty, insecurity, and jealousy. Victims find themselves unconsciously competing, desperate to regain approval and validation subtly withheld by the manipulator. Triangulation through praise exploits fundamental human emotional vulnerabilities, the innate desire for approval, validation, and reassurance. By carefully praising others, manipulators quietly but effectively undermine their victims' self-worth and emotional stability. Victims internalize emotional anxiety, constantly comparing themselves unfavorably, becoming increasingly emotionally dependent, and desperately seeking withheld approval and validation. This manipulative tactic profoundly impacts personal and professional relationships. In workplaces, a manipulative manager might subtly praise one employee's performance publicly while simultaneously withholding acknowledgement of another's equally valuable contributions. The overlooked employee feels anxious, competitive, and uncertain, desperately striving to regain withheld approval and recognition, often unaware they're being intentionally manipulated. Breaking free from triangulation through praise demands clear recognition of its calculated emotional manipulation. Victims must actively question emotional insecurity, jealousy, or anxiety created by external comparisons, consciously refusing to internalize subtle emotional undermining, carefully examining patterns of manipulative praise, and actively reinforcing emotional boundaries significantly weaken this manipulative tactic. Understanding triangulation through praise exposes one of the most disturbingly subtle yet profoundly damaging psychological manipulation strategies. It demonstrates how effectively manipulators exploit basic human emotional vulnerabilities, deliberately creating emotional insecurity and competition through calculated praise. Recognizing this manipulative tactic empowers victims to reclaim emotional autonomy, consciously rejecting manipulative comparisons and re-establishing genuine emotional security and confidence. By clearly understanding triangulation through praise, victims consciously break free from emotionally manipulative relationships, reclaim emotional stability, autonomy, and genuine self-esteem. Only then can victims genuinely experience emotional intimacy, self-worth, and authentic relationships, free from deliberate emotional manipulation through subtle comparisons masked as innocent praise. Ambient gaslighting. Imagine feeling constantly off balance, uncertain, and disconnected from reality, but unable to pinpoint exactly why. It's as if your life has shifted slightly out of focus, leaving you anxious, confused, and continuously questioning your perceptions. You're never quite certain if your concerns are valid or if you're overreacting to harmless behaviors. This profoundly unsettling sensation isn't accidental. It's the result of a carefully orchestrated psychological tactic known as ambient gaslighting. Ambient gaslighting is a subtle yet devastating manipulation technique used by narcissists and emotional manipulators to quietly destabilize their victim's sense of reality, perception, and emotional stability. Unlike more overt gaslighting, which involves direct denial or blatant contradiction of events, ambient gaslighting operates quietly beneath the surface, subtly distorting the victim's perception of reality through minimal, indirect actions, ambiguous communication, and consistently vague behavior. Consider Rachel and Brian. On the surface, Brian seemed supportive and reasonable. He rarely openly contradicted or directly accused Rachel of misunderstanding situations. Instead, Brian consistently engaged in ambiguous behaviors designed to confuse Rachel's sense of reality. He subtly rearranged items around their home, quietly claiming he hadn't touched them, causing Rachel to doubt her own memory. When Rachel mentioned important conversations, Brian gently feigned ignorance, quietly remarking, "Are you sure? I really don't recall us talking about that." Brian's subtle, ambiguous behavior extended into emotional interactions. When Rachel expressed genuine concerns, Brian quietly invalidated her perceptions with vague responses. "I think you're reading too much into things," he'd say gently, with quiet skepticism. "Maybe you're just tired or stressed." Over time, Rachel internalized doubt, constantly questioning her own perceptions, memories, and emotional responses. Brian never openly confronted or directly accused her. Instead, he quietly, steadily, and ambiguously destabilized her emotional and perceptual stability, leaving her constantly uncertain and emotionally dependent. The chilling effectiveness of ambient gaslighting lies precisely in its subtle ambiguity. Victims rarely recognize they're being manipulated because behaviors seem insignificant, indirect, or plausibly innocent. Yet, each subtle action accumulates, creating profound emotional confusion, insecurity, and self-doubt. Victims internalize anxiety, believing emotional instability or confusion reflects personal inadequacy rather than deliberate manipulation. Ambient gaslighting profoundly undermines emotional autonomy and stability. Victims become increasingly anxious, insecure, and uncertain, constantly seeking external validation or reassurance to confirm their perceptions of reality. The manipulator subtly reinforces this emotional dependency by carefully withholding genuine validation, ensuring victims remain emotionally vulnerable and continuously questioning their reality. This manipulation tactic frequently appears in professional settings as well. Managers employing ambient gaslighting subtly question employees' recollections, actions, or emotional responses, consistently providing ambiguous feedback or quietly invalidating concerns without explicit confrontation. Employees internalize uncertainty, self-doubt, and anxiety, significantly diminishing confidence and autonomy, allowing manipulators quiet emotional control. Breaking free from ambient gaslighting demands clear recognition of its subtle, indirect manipulation. Victims must consciously trust their perceptions, memories, and emotional responses, actively refusing internalization of ambiguous invalidation or skepticism. Documenting specific incidents, clearly articulating emotional boundaries, and seeking external validation from trusted individuals significantly aid victims in reclaiming emotional autonomy and perceptual stability. Understanding ambient gaslighting exposes one of the most disturbingly subtle yet profoundly damaging psychological manipulation strategies. It demonstrates how effectively manipulators exploit emotional vulnerabilities, deliberately creating profound emotional uncertainty, anxiety, and dependency through calculated ambiguity. Recognizing this manipulation tactic empowers victims to reclaim emotional clarity, consciously trusting their perceptions and confidently establishing emotional independence. By clearly understanding ambient gaslighting, victims consciously break free from emotionally manipulative relationships, reclaim emotional stability, autonomy, and genuine perceptual confidence. Only then can victims genuinely experience emotional intimacy, trust their perceptions, and confidently navigate reality, free from deliberate emotional manipulation through subtle, ambiguous behaviors and calculated uncertainty. Subtle boundary erosion. Picture yourself carefully drawing lines in the sand, marking your personal boundaries. Clearly define limits that protect your emotional, physical, and psychological well-being. These lines represent your values, comfort zones, and core identity. Now, imagine someone gently yet persistently brushing away those lines, one by one, quietly persuading you they're unnecessary or unfair, leaving you feeling exposed and uncertain. This disturbing psychological tactic, known as subtle boundary erosion, quietly dismantles personal boundaries without ever triggering immediate alarm, leaving victims increasingly vulnerable, anxious, and emotionally controlled. Subtle boundary erosion involves carefully and persistently pressuring victims to relinquish or soften their personal boundaries through seemingly innocent requests, gentle persuasion, or quiet manipulation. Unlike overt pressure or direct confrontation, this tactic quietly undermines boundaries through incremental, almost imperceptible shifts. Victims rarely realize their boundaries are being eroded until they feel profoundly vulnerable, uncomfortable, and unsure why. Consider Emma and Liam. Emma was initially confident, assertive, and emotionally secure, with clear personal boundaries around her private time, friendships, and personal space. Early in their relationship, Liam gently tested Emma's boundaries with seemingly innocent requests. He'd softly persuade Emma to skip activities with friends, to spend more time together, gently implying it was a small request reflecting their closeness. When Emma hesitated, Liam quietly suggested she was overly rigid or distant, subtly pressuring her to relent. Gradually, Liam's gentle persistence expanded into other areas of Emma's life, her hobbies, career decisions, even personal style choices. Liam always framed these suggestions gently, appearing supportive yet subtly critical of Emma's boundaries. "I'm only saying this because I care," he'd quietly explain. "Don't you think your friends expect too much from you? Maybe you should distance yourself." Over time, Emma internalized Liam's subtle manipulations, quietly relinquishing boundaries one by one, believing compromise reflected emotional closeness. The chilling effectiveness of subtle boundary erosion lies precisely in its incremental nature. Manipulators rarely openly confront or directly attack personal boundaries. Instead, they gently, repeatedly, and carefully persuade victims their boundaries are unnecessary, unfair, or selfish. Each boundary violation seems minor, easily rationalized or dismissed, but collectively, these subtle compromises profoundly weaken victims' emotional security, autonomy, and identity. Victims become increasingly emotionally vulnerable, anxious, and dependent, desperate to maintain emotional intimacy and approval. Subtle boundary erosion quietly exploits fundamental emotional vulnerabilities, desire for acceptance, approval, and intimacy, ensuring victims willingly relinquish emotional security to maintain manipulative relationships. Victims rarely recognize their emotional dependency results directly from deliberate boundary erosion, frequently assuming emotional insecurity reflects personal inadequacy rather than manipulative pressure. Subtle boundary erosion frequently operates in professional settings. Manipulative managers gently persuade employees to accept additional responsibilities, quietly disregarding personal boundaries regarding work-life balance, rest, or workload. Employees internalize anxiety, guilt, and uncertainty, increasingly relinquishing boundaries to maintain professional approval and validation, becoming profoundly vulnerable and emotionally dependent on manipulative validation. Breaking free from subtle boundary erosion demands victims clearly recognize this manipulative tactic as deliberate emotional control. Victims must actively question incremental boundary compromises, consciously reaffirming emotional autonomy and clearly articulating personal boundaries, establishing clear emotional limits, refusing internalization of subtle guilt or persuasion, and seeking external validation significantly weaken this manipulative tactic. Understanding subtle boundary erosion exposes one of the most disturbingly subtle yet profoundly damaging psychological manipulation strategies. It demonstrates how effectively manipulators exploit fundamental emotional vulnerabilities, deliberately creating profound emotional dependency through incremental boundary violations. Recognizing this manipulative tactic empowers victims to reclaim emotional clarity, consciously reaffirm personal boundaries, and confidently establish emotional autonomy. By clearly understanding subtle boundary erosion, victims consciously break free from emotionally manipulative relationships, reclaim emotional security, autonomy, and genuine identity. Only then can victims genuinely experience emotional intimacy, personal fulfillment, and authentic relationships, free from deliberate emotional manipulation through incremental boundary violations. Reality distortion field. Imagine entering a relationship or interaction with clear perceptions, convictions, and an unwavering sense of your own reality, only to emerge later feeling completely disoriented, uncertain, and questioning your very sanity. You sense something is profoundly off, yet can't precisely pinpoint what has changed or why you suddenly feel so insecure. This unsettling sensation isn't accidental. It's the result of a powerful psychological tactic known as the reality distortion field. The reality distortion field is a subtle yet deeply manipulative strategy commonly employed by narcissists and emotionally abusive individuals. It involves consistently reshaping, reframing, or distorting the victim's perceptions of events, memories, or conversations, subtly rewriting reality itself. Unlike overt gaslighting, which blatantly denies reality, the reality distortion field subtly alters facts, manipulates context, and quietly redefines shared experiences, leaving victims profoundly confused and emotionally vulnerable. Consider Mia and Jacob. Early on, Jacob appeared charming, thoughtful, and emotionally attentive. However, as their relationship deepened, Jacob began subtly reshaping their shared experiences. Whenever Mia recalled past events or important conversations, Jacob gently but persistently offered subtly altered interpretations. "I never said that," he'd say softly, yet convincingly. "You must have misunderstood." Over time, Jacob quietly convinced Mia her memories were consistently faulty, subtly rewriting their shared history. When Mia confronted Jacob about specific emotional hurts or unresolved conflicts, Jacob skillfully reframed these experiences, gently suggesting Mia exaggerated or misunderstood events. He'd quietly say things like, "That's not exactly how it happened, Mia. You seem to always remember things negatively." Mia began doubting herself, profoundly confused and uncertain. Gradually, she internalized Jacob's distorted reality, quietly accepting his subtle manipulation of their shared history as fact. The disturbing effectiveness of the reality distortion field lies precisely in its subtlety and persistent ambiguity. Victims rarely realize they're being deliberately manipulated, as distortions appear minor, plausible, and easily dismissed. Each subtly distorted memory, event, or experience accumulates over time, creating profound emotional confusion, anxiety, and self-doubt. Victims internalize deep emotional insecurity, quietly questioning their perceptions, memories, and emotional responses, becoming increasingly emotionally dependent and vulnerable. The reality distortion field profoundly undermines emotional autonomy, perceptual clarity, and self-confidence. Victims become uncertain, anxious, and desperate to regain emotional stability and clarity. Manipulators carefully exploit this emotional vulnerability, offering carefully crafted reassurance and validation, subtly reinforcing emotional dependency and ensuring continued control over their victims' perceptions and emotional experiences. This manipulation tactic frequently appears in professional environments as well. Manipulative bosses subtly redefine employees' contributions, subtly altering facts or reframing workplace achievements. Employees quietly internalize confusion, self-doubt, and anxiety, desperately striving to regain validation and clarity, significantly diminishing their emotional autonomy, confidence, and perceptual clarity. Breaking free from the reality distortion field demands clear recognition of its deliberate emotional manipulation. Victims must consciously trust their perceptions, memories, and emotional experiences, actively refusing internalization of subtly distorted realities, documenting events, clearly articulating emotional boundaries, seeking external validation, and professional support significantly aids victims in reclaiming emotional autonomy, clarity, and perceptual stability. Understanding the reality distortion field exposes one of the most disturbingly subtle yet profoundly damaging psychological manipulation strategies. It demonstrates how effectively manipulators exploit emotional vulnerability, deliberately creating profound emotional uncertainty, anxiety, and dependency through subtle, persistent reality distortions. Recognizing this manipulation tactic empowers victims to reclaim emotional clarity, consciously trusting perceptions, and confidently establishing emotional independence. By clearly understanding the reality distortion field, victims consciously break free from emotionally manipulative relationships, reclaiming emotional stability, autonomy, and genuine perceptual confidence. Only then can victims genuinely experience emotional intimacy, trust their perceptions, and confidently navigate reality, free from deliberate emotional manipulation through subtle yet powerful distortions of reality. Evasive compliance. Have you ever felt the frustration of getting someone's verbal agreement only to find that somehow nothing ever truly changes? On the surface, they seem cooperative and agreeable, even enthusiastic about meeting your needs. Yet, over time, you realize their actions remain elusive, incomplete, or consistently delayed, leaving you puzzled, frustrated, and emotionally exhausted. This unsettling scenario isn't accidental. It's a subtle, psychological tactic known as evasive compliance. Evasive compliance is a sophisticated manipulation strategy used by narcissists and emotionally manipulative people, skillfully combining apparent cooperation with intentional avoidance. It involves verbally agreeing, offering reassuring promises, and appearing genuinely cooperative, while quietly resisting, delaying, or avoiding actual follow-through. Unlike outright refusal or open confrontation, evasive compliance subtly confuses victims, creating emotional anxiety, uncertainty, and frustration through passive yet deliberate avoidance. Consider Amy and Ethan. Whenever Amy expressed concerns or emotional needs, Ethan readily offered verbal reassurances. He'd smile warmly, nod empathetically, and softly say, "You're absolutely right. I understand completely. I'll take care of it." Initially, Amy felt comforted, relieved, and emotionally reassured. Yet, days and weeks passed, and Ethan's promises quietly remained unfulfilled, his actions elusive and inconsistent. Whenever Amy gently reminded Ethan, he'd appear surprised, apologetic, and sincerely promise immediate action, only to quietly delay again. Over time, Amy internalized deep emotional anxiety, frustration, and self-doubt. Ethan's verbal compliance created emotional confusion as Amy desperately rationalized his repeated avoidance, assuming genuine misunderstanding or forgetfulness. Yet Ethan's consistent pattern of reassurance without actual action gradually left Amy emotionally exhausted, uncertain, and profoundly frustrated. Ethan skillfully maintained emotional control, ensuring Amy remained hopeful yet emotionally vulnerable, constantly seeking withheld emotional fulfillment. The chilling effectiveness of evasive compliance lies precisely in its subtle ambiguity. Victims rarely recognize deliberate manipulation, as verbal compliance creates plausible deniability. Manipulators consistently appear reasonable, cooperative, and emotionally supportive, quietly deflecting accusations through feigned confusion or sincere-sounding apologies. Victims internalize emotional confusion, questioning their perceptions, wondering if they're overly demanding or misunderstanding the situation. Evasive compliance profoundly undermines emotional stability, autonomy, and confidence. Victims experience intense emotional anxiety, frustration, and confusion, desperately striving to reconcile verbal promises with elusive actions. Manipulators carefully exploit this emotional uncertainty, subtly reinforcing dependency by withholding genuine, emotional fulfillment while appearing emotionally supportive. Victims become increasingly emotionally vulnerable, anxious, and dependent, desperately seeking withheld emotional validation and reassurance. This manipulative tactic frequently appears in professional settings. A manipulative manager consistently offers verbal reassurance regarding promotions, salary increases, or professional development, yet repeatedly avoids concrete actions. Employees internalize deep frustration, confusion, and anxiety, desperately seeking withheld professional validation and opportunities, quietly becoming emotionally dependent and vulnerable to continued manipulation. Breaking free from evasive compliance demands clear recognition of its deliberate emotional manipulation. Victims must consciously differentiate verbal reassurance from tangible actions, carefully examining consistent patterns of delayed or avoided compliance, establishing clear emotional boundaries, actively refusing internalization of emotional anxiety or confusion, and clearly articulating expectations significantly weaken this manipulative tactic. Seeking external validation, emotional support, and professional guidance significantly aids victims in reclaiming emotional autonomy and stability. Understanding evasive compliance exposes one of the most disturbingly subtle yet profoundly damaging psychological manipulation strategies. It demonstrates how effectively manipulators exploit emotional vulnerability, deliberately creating profound emotional anxiety, frustration, and dependency through calculated avoidance disguised as genuine cooperation. Recognizing this manipulation tactic empowers victims to reclaim emotional clarity, consciously trust perceptions, and confidently establish emotional independence. By clearly understanding evasive compliance, victims consciously break free from emotionally manipulative relationships, reclaim emotional stability, autonomy, and genuine emotional fulfillment. Only then can victims genuinely experience emotional intimacy, validation, and authentic relationships, free from deliberate emotional manipulation through subtle avoidance masked as sincere compliance. Moral credentialing. Have you ever encountered someone who regularly emphasizes their good deeds, moral values, or acts of kindness? At first glance, their moral superiority seems genuine, impressive, even admirable, yet over time, you notice they justify harmful actions, subtle manipulations, or unethical behaviors, using their past good deeds as a protective shield. This confusing contradiction isn't coincidental. It's a sophisticated psychological tactic known as moral credentialing. Moral credentialing involves consciously or unconsciously building a perceived moral reputation through positive actions, virtues, or behaviors, which then allows the manipulator to justify subsequent harmful, unethical, or emotionally damaging behaviors. Essentially, the manipulator accumulates moral credits through visible acts of kindness, generosity, or ethical behavior, creating a deceptive shield against future criticism or suspicion. They subtly persuade others, and even themselves, that their morally questionable behaviors are justified, understandable, or insignificant because they've proven themselves good through previous actions. Consider Rachel and Daniel. Early in their relationship, Daniel was exceptionally kind, generous, and morally upright. He frequently engaged in acts of charity, consistently supported social causes, and publicly demonstrated strong ethical values. Rachel admired Daniel's moral character, convinced she'd found a genuinely virtuous partner. Yet gradually, Daniel began exhibiting emotionally manipulative behaviors, subtle criticisms, emotional withdrawal, and occasional bursts of harshness or cruelty. Whenever Rachel confronted Daniel regarding these harmful behaviors, Daniel skillfully leveraged moral credentialing. He'd gently remind Rachel of his extensive charity work, volunteer efforts, and strong moral stances. "You know how much I care about people," Daniel would softly say. "Considering everything I do, can't you forgive a few minor mistakes?" Rachel found herself profoundly conflicted, confused, and emotionally unsettled, continually questioning whether she was unfairly criticizing a genuinely good person. The chilling effectiveness of moral credentialing lies precisely in its psychological ambiguity. Victims rarely suspect intentional manipulation, initially viewing the manipulator's good deeds as authentic reflections of character. The manipulator's moral reputation provides a powerful psychological shield, subtly persuading victims that subsequent harmful behaviors must be anomalies, misunderstandings, or minor lapses in judgment. Victims internalize emotional confusion, anxiety, and uncertainty, increasingly questioning their perceptions and quietly rationalizing emotional manipulation. Moral credentialing profoundly undermines emotional clarity, autonomy, and confidence. Victims consistently struggle with conflicting perceptions of the manipulator. Genuine moral goodness versus subtle emotional manipulation. Manipulators exploit this psychological conflict, skillfully reinforcing emotional dependency, ensuring victims remain emotionally vulnerable, confused, and hesitant to challenge harmful behaviors. This manipulation tactic frequently appears in professional settings as well. Manipulative managers regularly highlight past ethical actions or successful projects, using moral credentialing to subtly justify current unethical behaviors, questionable decisions, or emotional manipulations. Employees internalize emotional confusion, anxiety, and frustration, desperately striving to reconcile conflicting perceptions of their manager, significantly diminishing their emotional autonomy, confidence, and clarity. Breaking free from moral credentialing demands clear recognition of its calculated emotional manipulation. Victims must actively differentiate genuine morality from manipulative behaviors, consciously questioning subtle emotional contradictions, establishing clear emotional boundaries, actively refusing internalization of emotional confusion, and carefully examining consistent patterns of contradictory behavior significantly weaken this manipulative tactic. Seeking external validation, emotional support, and professional guidance significantly aids victims in reclaiming emotional autonomy, clarity, and stability. Understanding moral credentialing exposes one of the most disturbingly subtle yet profoundly damaging psychological manipulation strategies. It demonstrates how effectively manipulators exploit emotional vulnerability, deliberately creating profound emotional confusion, anxiety, and dependency through calculated moral contradictions. Recognizing this manipulation tactic empowers victims to reclaim emotional clarity, consciously trust perceptions, and confidently establish emotional independence. By clearly understanding moral credentialing, victims consciously break free from emotionally manipulative relationships, reclaim emotional stability, autonomy, and genuine emotional clarity. Only then can victims genuinely experience emotional intimacy, trust, and authentic relationships, free from deliberate emotional manipulation through subtle moral contradictions masked as genuine goodness. Empathy, mimicry. Have you ever met someone who seems deeply attuned to your emotions, mirroring your feelings and concerns perfectly, only to later sense something strangely hollow beneath their apparent warmth? At first, their genuine seeming empathy and emotional insight captivates you, making you feel deeply understood and emotionally connected. Yet slowly, you realize their empathy feels rehearsed, superficial, and disturbingly inconsistent. This unsettling phenomenon isn't accidental. It's a sophisticated psychological tactic known as empathy mimicry. Empathy mimicry involves deliberately imitating emotional responses, expressions of care, concern, and understanding, without genuinely experiencing or connecting emotionally with another person. Narcissists and emotional manipulators often employ empathy mimicry, skillfully replicating emotional intimacy, empathy, and genuine connection to establish emotional bonds and trust. Yet beneath their carefully constructed emotional facade, they remain emotionally detached, unempathetic, and driven by self-interest. Consider Jenna and Mike. Early in their relationship, Mike appeared exceptionally emotionally intuitive, mirroring Jenna's feelings, anxieties, and dreams with remarkable precision. Whenever Jenna expressed emotional vulnerability, Mike responded perfectly, offering comfort, validation, and emotional understanding, exactly matching Jenna's emotional needs. Jenna felt profoundly connected, emotionally supported, and convinced she'd found someone genuinely empathetic and emotionally attuned. Yet gradually, Jenna sensed subtle inconsistencies in Mike's empathy. Occasionally, his responses seemed strangely scripted, emotionally detached, or disturbingly generic. When Jenna confronted emotional complexities or required genuine empathy, Mike's emotional facade quietly faltered, revealing emotional emptiness or subtle irritation beneath superficial warmth. Jenna became profoundly confused, emotionally unsettled, and increasingly uncertain whether Mike's empathy was genuine or carefully rehearsed manipulation. The chilling effectiveness of empathy mimicry lies precisely in its subtlety and convincing emotional imitation. Victims rarely suspect deliberate manipulation, initially experiencing profound emotional intimacy, validation, and connection. Empathy mimicry skillfully exploits fundamental emotional vulnerabilities, human desire for empathy, emotional intimacy, and emotional validation, ensuring victims become emotionally dependent, profoundly vulnerable, and deeply trusting. Empathy mimicry profoundly undermines emotional autonomy, stability, and perceptual clarity. Victims internalize emotional confusion, anxiety, and self-doubt, desperately rationalizing subtle inconsistencies in emotional intimacy. Manipulators carefully exploit emotional vulnerability, maintaining emotional dependency through carefully controlled empathy mimicry, ensuring victims remain emotionally vulnerable, uncertain, and dependent. This manipulation tactic frequently operates in professional environments. Manipulative managers skillfully mimic emotional empathy, carefully expressing concern, validation, or emotional understanding without genuinely connecting emotionally. Employees internalize deep emotional confusion, anxiety, and dependency, desperately striving to reconcile emotional inconsistencies, significantly diminishing emotional autonomy, stability, and perceptual clarity. Breaking free from empathy mimicry demands clear recognition of its calculated emotional manipulation. Victims must actively differentiate genuine empathy from manipulative emotional imitation, carefully examining consistent emotional inconsistencies, scripted emotional responses, or superficial emotional warmth. Establishing clear emotional boundaries, consciously refusing emotional dependency, and actively seeking external emotional validation significantly weakens this manipulative tactic. Professional counseling, emotional support, and trusted external perspectives significantly aid victims in reclaiming emotional autonomy, stability, and clarity. Understanding empathy mimicry exposes one of the most disturbingly subtle yet profoundly damaging psychological manipulation strategies. It demonstrates how effectively manipulators exploit fundamental emotional vulnerabilities, deliberately creating profound emotional dependency, confusion, and uncertainty through carefully controlled emotional imitation. Recognizing empathy mimicry empowers victims to reclaim emotional clarity, consciously trust perceptions, and confidently establish emotional independence. By clearly understanding empathy mimicry, victims consciously break free from emotionally manipulative relationships, reclaim emotional stability, autonomy, and genuine emotional intimacy. Only then can victims genuinely experience authentic emotional connection, empathy, and intimacy, free from deliberate emotional manipulation through superficial emotional imitation and carefully rehearsed emotional deception. Pseudo authenticity. You meet someone who seems incredibly genuine, open, and honest from the very first encounter. They freely admit their flaws, vulnerabilities, and past mistakes, creating an immediate sense of trust and emotional intimacy. Their authenticity feels refreshing, inspiring deep emotional connections, and you quickly believe you've discovered someone profoundly real and trustworthy. Yet over time, subtle inconsistencies begin to surface. Something feels slightly off, leaving you confused and uncertain about their true nature. This unsettling phenomenon isn't accidental. It's a sophisticated psychological tactic known as pseudo authenticity. Pseudo authenticity involves deliberately portraying oneself as emotionally transparent, vulnerable, and genuine, carefully constructing an illusion of sincerity and honesty without truly revealing genuine inner motivations, emotions, or intentions. Narcissists and emotional manipulators often employ pseudo authenticity, skillfully simulating emotional vulnerability and honesty to establish trust, emotional intimacy, and dependency. Beneath their carefully maintained facade of openness lies calculated emotional manipulation, self-serving motivations, and subtle emotional deceit. Consider the relationship between Grace and Tom. When they first met, Tom appeared remarkably authentic, openly discussing personal challenges, emotional vulnerabilities, and past struggles. Grace felt deeply connected, emotionally drawn to Tom's seemingly genuine openness and honesty. His willingness to expose vulnerabilities convinced Grace she'd found someone uniquely sincere and emotionally transparent, creating profound trust and emotional intimacy. Yet gradually, Grace sensed subtle inconsistencies in Tom's authenticity. Occasionally, his emotional disclosures felt strangely rehearsed, overly calculated, or disturbingly superficial. When confronted with deeper emotional complexity or genuine vulnerability, Tom's authenticity quietly faltered, replaced by emotional withdrawal, defensiveness, or subtle irritation. Grace became profoundly confused, emotionally unsettled, and uncertain whether Tom's authenticity was genuine emotional transparency or carefully constructed emotional deception. The chilling effectiveness of pseudo-authenticity lies precisely in its convincing emotional facade. Victims rarely suspect deliberate manipulation, initially experiencing profound emotional connection, intimacy, and trust. Pseudo-authenticity exploits fundamental emotional vulnerabilities, human desires for authenticity, emotional intimacy, and emotional honesty, ensuring victims become emotionally dependent, profoundly trusting, and deeply vulnerable. Pseudo-authenticity profoundly undermines emotional clarity, autonomy, and perceptual stability. Victims internalize emotional confusion, anxiety, and uncertainty, desperately rationalizing subtle emotional inconsistencies or superficial authenticity. Manipulators carefully exploit emotional vulnerability, maintaining emotional dependency through carefully controlled pseudo-authenticity, ensuring victims remain emotionally uncertain, trusting, and dependent. This manipulation tactic frequently operates in professional environments as well. Manipulative managers skillfully portray themselves as open, transparent, and genuinely vulnerable, carefully creating emotional trust and intimacy. Employees internalize profound emotional confusion, anxiety, and dependency, desperately rationalizing subtle emotional inconsistencies, significantly diminishing emotional autonomy, stability, and perceptual clarity. Breaking free from pseudo-authenticity demands clear recognition of its calculated emotional manipulation. Victims must actively differentiate genuine emotional transparency from superficial emotional performance, carefully examining consistent emotional inconsistencies, rehearsed emotional disclosures, or subtly deceptive emotional behaviors, establishing clear emotional boundaries, consciously refusing emotional dependency, and actively seeking external emotional validation significantly weakens this manipulative tactic. Professional counseling, emotional support, and trusted external perspectives significantly aid victims in reclaiming emotional autonomy, stability, and clarity. Understanding pseudo-authenticity exposes one of the most disturbingly subtle yet profoundly damaging psychological manipulation strategies. It demonstrates how effectively manipulators exploit fundamental emotional vulnerabilities, deliberately creating profound emotional dependency, confusion, and uncertainty through carefully controlled emotional deception, disguised as genuine authenticity. Recognizing pseudo-authenticity empowers victims to reclaim emotional clarity, consciously trust perceptions, and confidently establish emotional independence. By clearly understanding pseudo authenticity, victims consciously break free from emotionally manipulative relationships, reclaim emotional stability, autonomy, and genuine emotional intimacy. Only then can victims genuinely experience authentic emotional connection, vulnerability, and intimacy, free from deliberate emotional manipulation through carefully rehearsed emotional deceit disguised as genuine transparency. Inverted narcissism. Imagine meeting someone who consistently portrays themselves as deeply humble, self-sacrificing, and intensely focused on others. At first glance, their behavior seems selfless, even noble. They're perpetually the victim, always willing to set aside their needs, desires, and dreams to support others, often to their own emotional detriment. Yet over time, you sense something unsettling beneath their apparent humility, realizing their constant self-sacrifice feels manipulative, attention-seeking, and disturbingly self-centered. This profoundly confusing dynamic isn't coincidental. It's a sophisticated psychological tactic known as inverted narcissism. Inverted narcissism involves expressing narcissistic needs, desires, and behaviors through self-sacrifice, excessive humility, victimhood, and obsessive devotion to others. Unlike traditional narcissism, characterized by overt arrogance, entitlement, and explicit self-centeredness, inverted narcissism manifests as persistent emotional martyrdom, quiet self-pity, and subtle manipulation through constant self-sacrifice. Beneath their carefully constructed facade of humility and victimhood, inverted narcissists harbor profound emotional needs for attention, validation, sympathy, and emotional control. Consider Laura and Mark. Laura consistently portrayed herself as deeply selfless, humble, and emotionally devoted to others. She willingly sacrificed personal goals, desires, and emotional well-being, consistently placing others' needs above her own. Initially, Mark admired Laura's apparent selflessness, emotionally drawn to her seemingly genuine humility and devotion. Laura's quiet emotional martyrdom created profound emotional connection, sympathy, and intimacy, convincing Mark he'd found someone uniquely humble and self-sacrificing. Yet gradually, Mark sensed subtle emotional manipulations beneath Laura's apparent humility. Laura consistently portrayed herself as a victim, subtly evoking guilt, sympathy, and emotional dependency through her emotional suffering and excessive self-sacrifice. When Mark expressed emotional boundaries, personal needs, or emotional autonomy, Laura quietly portrayed herself as emotionally wounded, gently but persistently implying Mark was selfish, uncaring, or emotionally insensitive. Mark became profoundly confused, emotionally anxious, and increasingly uncertain about maintaining emotional boundaries or asserting personal autonomy. The chilling effectiveness of inverted narcissism lies precisely in its convincing emotional humility and persistent victimhood. Victims rarely suspect deliberate emotional manipulation, initially viewing inverted narcissists as genuinely selfless, humble, and emotionally devoted. Inverted narcissism exploits fundamental emotional vulnerabilities, human desires for emotional intimacy, validation, and connection, ensuring victims become profoundly emotionally dependent, consistently guilt-ridden, and deeply vulnerable. Inverted narcissism profoundly undermines emotional autonomy, stability, and perceptual clarity. Victims internalize emotional confusion, anxiety, and profound guilt, desperately rationalizing subtle emotional manipulations masked as genuine humility or self-sacrifice. Manipulators carefully exploit emotional vulnerability, maintaining emotional dependency through persistent victimhood, emotional martyrdom, and subtle guilt, ensuring victims remain emotionally anxious, uncertain, and dependent. This manipulative tactic frequently operates in professional environments. Manipulative coworkers or managers consistently portray themselves as emotionally burdened, excessively humble, and profoundly self-sacrificing. Colleagues internalize deep emotional guilt, anxiety, and dependency, desperately striving to alleviate the manipulator's emotional burdens, significantly diminishing emotional autonomy, stability, and professional clarity. Breaking free from inverted narcissism demands clear recognition of its calculated emotional manipulation. Victims must actively differentiate genuine humility from manipulative emotional martyrdom, carefully examining consistent patterns of emotional victimhood, excessive self-sacrifice, and subtle emotional guilt, establishing clear emotional boundaries, consciously refusing internalization of emotional guilt, and actively seeking external emotional validation significantly weaken this manipulative tactic. Professional counseling, emotional support, and trusted external perspectives significantly aid victims in reclaiming emotional autonomy, stability, and clarity. Understanding inverted narcissism exposes one of the most disturbingly subtle yet profoundly damaging psychological manipulation strategies. It demonstrates how effectively manipulators exploit fundamental emotional vulnerabilities, deliberately creating profound emotional dependency, guilt, and anxiety through persistent emotional martyrdom and calculated victimhood. Recognizing inverted narcissism empowers victims to reclaim emotional clarity, consciously trust perceptions, and confidently establish emotional independence. By clearly understanding inverted narcissism, victims consciously break free from emotionally manipulative relationships, reclaim emotional stability, autonomy, and genuine emotional intimacy. Only then can victims genuinely experience authentic emotional connection, self-worth, and healthy relationships, free from deliberate emotional manipulation through subtle martyrdom and emotionally manipulative humility. Emotional breadcrumbing. Imagine being drawn into an emotional maze, guided only by tiny fragments of affection, attention, and hope. Breadcrumbs scattered sparingly along a confusing path. Each breadcrumb offers just enough emotional nourishment to keep you invested, yet never truly satisfies your deeper emotional hunger or needs. This confusing emotional cycle isn't accidental. It's a calculated psychological tactic known as emotional breadcrumbing. Emotional breadcrumbing involves intentionally providing minimal emotional engagement, tiny glimpses of affection, attention, or reassurance to maintain a victim's interest, emotional investment, and hope without genuinely committing emotionally. Unlike authentic emotional intimacy, characterized by consistent emotional availability, trust, and meaningful connection, emotional breadcrumbing deliberately creates emotional uncertainty, anxiety, and dependency through carefully rationed emotional attention and affection. Consider Sarah and Alex. Early in their relationship, Alex consistently provided genuine seeming emotional affection, attention, and validation, creating profound emotional connection and intimacy. Gradually, Alex's emotional engagement became increasingly inconsistent, elusive, and superficial. Whenever Sarah expressed emotional vulnerability, Alex offered minimal reassurance, a brief text, occasional phone call, or fleeting moments of affection. Each small emotional gesture temporarily alleviated Sarah's anxiety, leaving her emotionally hopeful yet profoundly confused and uncertain. Whenever Sarah confronted Alex regarding emotional inconsistency or detachment, Alex skillfully deflected, gently implying Sarah was overly sensitive, demanding, or emotionally insecure. Each minimal emotional breadcrumb maintained Sarah's emotional investment, perpetuating emotional dependency and confusion. Sarah consistently rationalized Alex's emotional detachment, desperately believing genuine emotional intimacy and consistency would eventually return, trapped by persistent emotional hope, uncertainty, and anxiety. The chilling effectiveness of emotional breadcrumbing lies precisely in its calculated ambiguity and subtle emotional manipulation. Victims rarely suspect intentional emotional withholding, initially viewing minimal emotional gestures as sincere, genuine, or meaningful. Emotional breadcrumbing skillfully exploits fundamental emotional vulnerabilities, human desires for emotional intimacy, connection, and validation, ensuring victims become profoundly emotionally dependent, hopeful, and vulnerable. Emotional breadcrumbing profoundly undermines emotional autonomy, stability, and perceptual clarity. Victims internalize deep emotional confusion, anxiety, and uncertainty, desperately rationalizing emotional inconsistencies and minimal emotional gestures. Manipulators carefully exploit emotional vulnerability, maintaining emotional dependency through carefully controlled emotional scarcity and ambiguity, ensuring victims remain emotionally anxious, uncertain, and dependent. This manipulation tactic frequently operates in professional environments as well. Manipulative managers consistently provide minimal professional validation, occasional acknowledgement, or subtle emotional attention to employees, skillfully maintaining emotional dependency, anxiety, and professional uncertainty. Employees internalize profound emotional confusion, anxiety, and dependency, desperately rationalizing minimal professional gestures, significantly diminishing emotional autonomy, stability, and perceptual clarity. Breaking free from emotional breadcrumbing demands clear recognition of its calculated emotional manipulation. Victims must actively differentiate genuine emotional intimacy from manipulative emotional scarcity, carefully examining consistent emotional inconsistencies, minimal emotional gestures, and persistent emotional ambiguity, establishing clear emotional boundaries, consciously refusing emotional dependency, and actively seeking external emotional validation significantly weaken this manipulative tactic. Professional counseling, emotional support, and trusted external perspectives significantly aid victims in reclaiming emotional autonomy, stability, and clarity. Understanding emotional breadcrumbing exposes one of the most disturbingly subtle yet profoundly damaging psychological manipulation strategies. It demonstrates how effectively manipulators exploit fundamental emotional vulnerabilities, deliberately creating profound emotional dependency, confusion, and anxiety through calculated emotional scarcity and minimal emotional gestures. Recognizing emotional breadcrumbing empowers victims to reclaim emotional clarity, consciously trust perceptions, and confidently establish emotional independence. By clearly understanding emotional breadcrumbing, victims consciously break free from emotionally manipulative relationships, reclaim emotional stability, autonomy, and genuine emotional intimacy. Only then can victims genuinely experience authentic emotional connection, affection, and intimacy, free from deliberate emotional manipulation through carefully rationed emotional gestures and calculated emotional scarcity. Context manipulation. Imagine vividly remembering a conversation or event, confidently recalling every detail, only to find the other person subtly changing the circumstances, shifting the narrative, and carefully reframing the entire scenario. Suddenly, your perception seems flawed, your memories questionable, your emotional reactions inappropriate. This disorienting experience isn't accidental. It's a calculated psychological tactic known as context manipulation. Context manipulation involves deliberately altering, distorting, or selectively presenting facts, events, or circumstances to influence perception, interpretation, and emotional responses. Unlike overt lies or blatant deception, context manipulation subtly reshapes narratives, carefully controls perspectives, and quietly undermines victims' perceptions without directly contradicting facts. It skillfully exploits human reliance on context, emotional frameworks surrounding events, interactions, or conversations to significantly alter emotional responses, perceptions, and interpretations. Consider Emily and Daniel. After a heated disagreement, Emily clearly recalled Daniel angrily criticizing her career choices, emotional reactions, and personal goals. Days later, when Emily confronted Daniel about his harsh words, Daniel skillfully reframed the entire event. He gently implied Emily misunderstood the context entirely, softly stating, "You misread my intentions completely. I was concerned, not angry. Perhaps you were emotional and took things the wrong way." Initially, Emily firmly trusted her memories, emotional responses, and perceptions. Yet Daniel consistently manipulated context, skillfully adjusting tone, intent, and emotional frameworks, leaving Emily profoundly confused, uncertain, and emotionally anxious. Each subtle manipulation weakened Emily's confidence in her emotional experiences, gradually causing profound emotional self-doubt, confusion, and anxiety. The disturbing effectiveness of context manipulation lies precisely in its subtlety and plausible ambiguity. Victims rarely suspect intentional manipulation, initially viewing altered context as genuine misunderstandings or innocent miscommunications. Context manipulation skillfully exploits fundamental emotional vulnerabilities, human desires for clarity, understanding, and emotional validation, ensuring victims become profoundly emotionally dependent, uncertain, and anxious. Context manipulation profoundly undermines emotional autonomy, clarity, and perceptual stability. Victims internalize deep emotional confusion, anxiety, and self-doubt, desperately rationalizing subtle, contextual inconsistencies. Manipulators carefully exploit emotional vulnerability, maintaining emotional dependency through consistently altered contexts, reframed narratives, and subtle emotional ambiguity, ensuring victims remain emotionally uncertain, anxious, and dependent. This manipulative tactic frequently operates in professional environments. Manipulative coworkers or managers skillfully reframe events, subtly altering emotional frameworks, intentions, or circumstances. Employees internalize profound emotional confusion, anxiety, and dependency, desperately rationalizing altered contexts and reframed narratives, significantly diminishing emotional autonomy, professional clarity, and perceptual stability. Breaking free from context manipulation demands clear recognition of its calculated emotional manipulation. Victims must actively differentiate genuine misunderstandings from manipulative context reframing, carefully examining consistent narrative alterations, subtle emotional reframing, and persistent contextual ambiguity. Establishing clear emotional boundaries, consciously refusing internalization of emotional confusion, and actively seeking external emotional validation significantly weaken this manipulative tactic. Professional counseling, emotional support, and trusted external perspectives significantly aid victims in reclaiming emotional autonomy, stability, and clarity. Understanding context manipulation exposes one of the most disturbingly subtle yet profoundly damaging psychological manipulation strategies. It demonstrates how effectively manipulators exploit fundamental emotional vulnerabilities, deliberately creating profound emotional dependency, confusion, and uncertainty through calculated, contextual distortions and reframed narratives. Recognizing context manipulation empowers victims to reclaim emotional clarity, consciously trust perceptions, and confidently establish emotional independence. By clearly understanding context manipulation, victims consciously break free from emotionally manipulative relationships, reclaim emotional stability, autonomy, and genuine emotional intimacy. Only then can victims genuinely experience authentic emotional connection, trust their perceptions, and confidently navigate reality, free from deliberate emotional manipulation through subtle context distortions and carefully reframed emotional narratives. Blame-shifting amnesia. Imagine vividly recalling an argument or confrontation where someone clearly hurt you or behaved unfairly. You confidently confront them later, seeking acknowledgement or even an apology, yet suddenly they claim to have absolutely no memory of the event. They look genuinely confused, even hurt, softly accusing you of exaggerating, misremembering, or inventing offenses. You feel disoriented, frustrated, and deeply unsettled, uncertain whether you should trust your memory or question your perception entirely. This disturbing dynamic isn't coincidental. It's a calculated psychological tactic known as blame-shifting amnesia. Blame-shifting amnesia involves deliberately claiming to forget, minimize, or deny hurtful actions, emotional behaviors, or harmful incidents, carefully shifting blame or responsibility back onto the victim. Unlike genuine forgetfulness, blame-shifting amnesia is selective, strategic, and emotionally manipulative, allowing the perpetrator to avoid accountability, undermine the victim's perceptions, and quietly portray the victim as emotionally irrational, oversensitive, or unreliable. Consider Emma and Tom. During a heated argument, Tom sharply criticized Emma's intelligence, capabilities, and emotional stability, deeply hurting Emma's feelings. Later, when Emma courageously confronted Tom about his harsh words, seeking acknowledgement or an apology, Tom skillfully employed blame-shifting amnesia. He looked genuinely confused, gently claiming, "I honestly don't remember saying those things, Emma. Are you sure you're not imagining it? Maybe you're overly sensitive." Initially, Emma confidently trusted her memory, emotional reactions, and perceptions, yet Tom consistently claimed selective forgetfulness, gently suggesting Emma exaggerated, misremembered, or invented offenses. Each incident of blame-shifting amnesia left Emma profoundly confused, emotionally uncertain, and increasingly anxious. Gradually, Emma internalized emotional self-doubt, constantly questioning her memories, perceptions, and emotional responses, emotionally dependent on Tom's interpretations. The chilling effectiveness of blame-shifting amnesia lies precisely in its plausible ambiguity and selective forgetfulness. Victims rarely suspect intentional emotional manipulation, initially viewing apparent forgetfulness as genuine misunderstandings, innocent miscommunications, or sincere confusion. Blame-shifting amnesia skillfully exploits fundamental emotional vulnerabilities, human desires for validation, clarity, and emotional acknowledgement, ensuring victims become profoundly emotionally dependent, anxious, and deeply uncertain. Blame-shifting amnesia profoundly undermines emotional autonomy, stability, and perceptual clarity. Victims internalize deep emotional confusion, anxiety, and self-doubt, desperately rationalizing selective forgetfulness and emotional invalidation. Manipulators carefully exploit emotional vulnerability, maintaining emotional dependency through carefully controlled blame-shifting amnesia, ensuring victims remain emotionally uncertain, anxious, and profoundly dependent. This manipulative tactic frequently operates in professional environments as well. Manipulative coworkers or managers skillfully claim selective forgetfulness regarding workplace conflicts, inappropriate comments, or harmful behaviors. Employees internalize profound emotional confusion, anxiety, and dependency, desperately rationalizing selective forgetfulness and emotional invalidation, significantly diminishing emotional autonomy, professional confidence, and perceptual stability. Breaking free from blame-shifting amnesia demands clear recognition of its calculated emotional manipulation. Victims must actively differentiate genuine forgetfulness from manipulative selective memory, carefully examining consistent emotional invalidation, selective denials, and persistent emotional minimization, establishing clear emotional boundaries, consciously refusing internalization of emotional confusion, and actively seeking external emotional validation significantly weaken this manipulative tactic. Professional counseling, emotional support, and trusted external perspectives significantly aid victims in reclaiming emotional autonomy, stability, and clarity. Understanding blame-shifting amnesia exposes one of the most disturbingly subtle yet profoundly damaging psychological manipulation strategies. It demonstrates how effectively manipulators exploit fundamental emotional vulnerabilities, deliberately creating profound emotional dependency, confusion, and uncertainty through calculated emotional invalidation masked as genuine forgetfulness. Recognizing blame-shifting amnesia empowers victims to reclaim emotional clarity, consciously trust perceptions, and confidently establish emotional independence. By clearly understanding blame-shifting amnesia, victims consciously break free from emotionally manipulative relationships, reclaim emotional stability, autonomy, and genuine emotional clarity. Only then can victims genuinely experience authentic emotional connection, trust their memories, and confidently navigate emotional reality, free from deliberate emotional manipulation through subtle selective forgetfulness and carefully controlled emotional invalidation.